Please, mister. I only took it because my sister hasn't eaten since yesterday. The homeless boy stood frozen beside the bakery counter with a loaf of bread clutched against his torn coat, while the baker raised a broom like a weapon and half the town gathered to watch. His cheeks were hollow, his boots were split, and his hands shook so badly that crumbs fell through his fingers onto the wooden floor. Everyone saw a thief. Everyone saw trouble. Everyone saw one more ragged child who did not belong in Cedar Hollow. But old Dr. Elias Monroe saw something else. Pinned inside the boy's coat, nearly hidden beneath dirt and frayed cloth, was a tarnished army button from a uniform no child should have possessed. The moment the doctor saw the cross sabers stamped into the metal, his breath caught in his chest. He had seen that button once before, on a battlefield hospital cot 20 years earlier, sewn to the coat of a dying soldier who had begged him to protect his family if the truth ever surfaced. And now, standing in a bakery with a stolen loaf of bread, was a starving boy wearing the last clue to a promise the doctor had failed to keep. The first snow of December came down over Cedar Hollow with the quiet cruelty of something beautiful and deadly. It covered wagon ruts, barn roofs, fence rails, and the frozen tracks leading into town, softening every hard edge until the whole settlement looked almost peaceful. But beauty did not fill empty stomachs. It did not mend split boots. It did not warm children sleeping beneath the broken awning of an abandoned freight shed. 12-year-old Caleb Turner knew that better than anyone. He had spent the night curled around his little sister Ruth behind stacked crates near the railroad platform, using his own body as a wall against the wind. Ruth was 7, feverish, and too quiet. That frightened him more than her crying ever had. Children cried when they still believed someone might answer. Ruth had stopped crying before dawn. By morning, Caleb's fingers were numb, his throat burned from cold air, and his stomach twisted so sharply that he could barely stand. He looked down at Ruth, who slept with her face pressed into his coat sleeve. Her blonde hair was tangled beneath a torn bonnet. Her lips had turned pale. "I'll get food," he whispered, though he had no idea how. She stirred but did not wake. Caleb tucked the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders and stepped out into the snow. Cedar Hollow was beginning its day. Smoke rose from chimneys. Horses snorted outside the livery. A freight wagon rattled past the general store. Men in heavy coats hurried toward work. Women carrying baskets moved quickly along the boardwalk. No one looked at Caleb for long. People glanced, saw rags, hunger, dirt, and bare wrists, then looked away. A town could make a child invisible if it tried hard enough. He walked past the church, past the blacksmith shop, past the sheriff's office, where a deputy leaned inside the doorway drinking coffee. The smell reached him before the sign did. Fresh bread, warm bread. Bread with a crust crisp from the oven, and a center soft enough for Ruth to swallow. Caleb stopped in front of Harlan's bakery with one hand against the window. Inside, golden loaves rested on shelves behind the counter. Mrs. Harlan was wrapping rolls for a customer. Mr. Harlan carried trays from the back room, red-faced from the oven heat. Caleb's mouth filled with saliva so painfully he nearly groaned. He had begged the day before. The baker had threatened to call the deputy. He had tried offering to sweep the alley, but Mr. Harlan said boys like him stole more than they worked. Caleb knew he should walk away. He told himself he would find another way. But then he saw Ruth's face in his mind, pale and still beneath the freight shed awning, and something inside him broke. He slipped into the bakery when the door opened for a woman leaving with a paper-wrapped parcel. Warmth struck him like a blessing. The smell almost made him dizzy. Nobody noticed him at first. He moved quickly, quietly, like a stray dog used to being kicked. A small loaf sat near the edge of the counter, cooling on a cloth. His hand reached before his conscience could stop it. He grabbed the bread, turned toward the door, and collided straight into Mr. Harlan. The baker looked down, then at the loaf, then at Caleb's face. "Thief!" The word cracked through the bakery like a whip. Caleb bolted, but Mr. Harlan caught the back of his coat and yanked him so hard he nearly fell. The loaf remained clutched to his chest. "Let go!" Caleb cried. "Please!" Mrs. Harlan gasped. Customers turned. The baker dragged him toward the center of the room. "I told you not to come back." Caleb twisted in his grip. "My sister's sick. Your sister isn't my problem. She'll die. Then take her to the poorhouse." Fear made Caleb wild. He tried to pull free again, but the baker raised a broom from beside the counter. "Hold still!" The commotion spilled through the open door and onto the street. Within moments, people gathered outside the bakery window. A few entered. A deputy stepped in from the boardwalk, chewing slowly as though the matter bored him. Caleb's face burned with shame. He would have endured a beating. He had endured worse. But the thought of Ruth waiting alone while he stood trapped with food in his arms nearly made him sick. "I only took one," he said, voice cracking. "I'll work for it, mister." Harlan snatched the bread from him. "You'll work in jail," the deputy sighed. "Name?" Caleb stared at the floor. "Caleb." "Caleb what?" Silence. The deputy stepped closer. "Boy, I asked your name." Caleb swallowed. He had learned not to give his last name. Names were handles grown men used to drag you back into trouble. "Just Caleb." The baker grabbed his collar. "Search him. Probably stole from half the town." Caleb jerked away, but the deputy caught his arm. During the struggle, Caleb's coat tore open near the chest. Something small and metal, tied inside with a piece of old thread, flashed in the bakery light. Most people missed it. The deputy missed it. The baker missed it. But someone standing near the doorway did not. Dr. Elias Monroe had entered quietly only moments earlier to buy bread for 2 patients. He was 70 years old, with a narrow frame, silver hair, a neatly trimmed white beard, and tired gray eyes that had seen too many wounds to be surprised easily. He carried a black medical bag in one hand and leaned slightly on a polished cane. For 50 years he had delivered babies, set bones, closed bullet wounds, and sat beside dying beds across 3 counties. People said old Doc Monroe remembered every scar in Cedar Hollow. But the moment he saw the tarnished army button sewn inside the homeless boy's coat, the doctor's face changed. The button was brass, darkened by age, dented along one edge, stamped with crossed cavalry sabers, and a tiny broken star beneath them. It was not common. It had belonged to the 9th Frontier Cavalry, a unit disbanded after a scandal the Army preferred forgotten. Elias had last seen a button like it in a field hospital near Antelope Ridge 20 years earlier, when a young sergeant named Thomas Turner had grabbed his sleeve with blood-soaked fingers and whispered, "If they come for my wife, find the button." The truth is with the children. The memory struck the doctor so hard that the bakery seemed to tilt around him. Thomas Turner. Turner. The boy had refused his last name. Elias looked at Caleb again, truly looked this time. The sharp cheekbones, the dark eyes, the stubborn mouth, the same mouth that dying soldier had used to beg for mercy he never received. "Stop," the doctor said. The deputy glanced back. "Doc?" Elias stepped forward. "Let the boy go." Mr. Harlan frowned. "He stole bread." I said let him go. There was something in the old doctor's voice that made even the deputy hesitate. Caleb stared at him with suspicion, still breathing hard. Elias reached slowly toward the torn coat. Caleb flinched backward. The doctor's expression softened. "I won't hurt you." Everyone says that before they do. The words silenced the room. Elias lowered his hand. "Where did you get that button?" Caleb's fingers immediately covered the brass piece. "It's mine." "I didn't ask whose it was. I asked where you got it." Caleb looked toward the door, calculating whether he could run. The deputy tightened his grip. Elias's eyes hardened. "Release him." This time the deputy obeyed. Caleb backed toward the wall, one hand over the button, the other curled into a fist, much too small for the men around him. "My father had it," he said finally. The bakery grew quiet. Elias felt his pulse quicken. "What was your father's name?" Caleb's jaw locked. "Dead." "His name, son." The boy's eyes filled with anger. "Dead men don't need names." Elias absorbed the blow of that answer without showing it. "Does your sister have one?" Caleb's face changed instantly. "Too much." Elias saw it. "Where is she?" Caleb shook his head. "Nowhere." "Is she sick?" Silence. Elias stepped closer. Slowly. "I am a doctor." Caleb's eyes flicked to the black medical bag. Hope appeared for half a second before suspicion crushed it. "Doctors cost money." "Not today." Mr. Harlan muttered. "Doc, don't let him fool you." Elias turned on him with a look sharp enough to cut rope. "Give him the bread." The baker blinked. "What?" "The loaf." "Give it back." "He stole it. and I am buying it. The doctor placed coins on the counter without looking away from Caleb. 2 loaves, and milk if you have it. Mrs. Harlan moved before her husband could object. She wrapped bread in cloth and added a small bottle of milk from the back shelf. Caleb stared at the food as if afraid it might vanish. Elias took the bundle and held it out. "Take me to your sister." Caleb did not move. Why? Because fever doesn't wait for trust. That sentence reached him. Ruth's face returned in his mind. Pale lips, quiet breathing, too quiet. Slowly, Caleb accepted the bundle. His hands shook around it. Then he looked at the deputy, the baker, the watching townspeople, and finally the doctor. "If this is a trick," Elias nodded, "then you'll hate me with good reason." Caleb studied him for one more second. Then he slipped past the crowd and out into the snow. Elias followed with his medical bag, leaving the bakery buzzing behind them. The boy moved fast through side alleys and behind buildings, always glancing back, always ready to disappear. The doctor struggled to keep up but refused to complain. They reached the abandoned freight shed near the railroad platform, where wind pushed snow through gaps in the boards. Caleb dropped to his knees beside a small bundle beneath the awning. Ruth. The little girl did not answer. Elias knelt immediately. Ruth's skin burned with fever despite the cold. Her breathing rattled faintly. Her pulse fluttered weakly beneath his fingers. Caleb watched with terror barely contained. "Can you fix her?" Elias opened his bag. "I can help her." "That's not what I asked." The doctor looked up. "It's the honest answer." Caleb nodded once, accepting honesty more easily than comfort. Elias worked quickly. He wrapped Ruth in a warmer blanket from his bag, gave her a few drops of medicine, checked her lungs, and instructed Caleb to tear bread into tiny pieces once she woke. As he worked, his eyes kept returning to the button inside the boy's torn coat. Thomas Turner's voice echoed in his memory. "The truth is with the children." Finally, Ruth stirred. Her eyes opened just a little. "Caleb?" The boy nearly collapsed with relief. "I'm here." Elias watched them. An old guilt pressed against his chest. 20 years ago, a dying soldier had entrusted him with a promise. He had searched once, briefly, then war ended, records vanished, and life buried the failure beneath years of patience and graves. Now the promise had returned in the form of 2 starving children beneath a freight shed. "Caleb," he said quietly. The boy looked at him. "Your father's name was Thomas Turner, wasn't it?" Caleb went completely still. Ruth's eyes widened. The wind howled through the broken boards. Elias knew before the boy answered. Caleb's hand closed around the army button. "Who told you that?" Before Elias could respond, a train whistle screamed in the distance. At the same moment, 2 men in dark coats stepped onto the far end of the platform. They were not townsmen. They moved with purpose, scanning the shed, the tracks, the alleys. One of them held a folded paper. The other carried a rifle beneath his coat. Caleb saw them and turned white. Elias noticed instantly. "You know them?" Caleb grabbed Ruth's hand. "They found us." "Who?" The boy's voice dropped to a terrified whisper. "The men who killed Mama. The men who killed Mama." Caleb Turner's whisper seemed to drain the warmth from the entire freight shed. Dr. Elias Monroe looked from the boy's white face to the 2 dark-coated strangers moving along the platform beyond the snow. One held a folded paper as if reading descriptions. The other kept one hand inside his coat where the doctor had practiced medicine long enough to know a weapon rested. Ruth stirred beneath the blanket, too weak to understand the danger, while Caleb shifted instinctively in front of her. The movement was small but fierce, the posture of a child who had already decided his life mattered less than his sister's. Elias felt an old wound open inside him. He had seen that posture before. Thomas Turner had worn it in a field hospital 20 years earlier, bleeding through bandages while begging the doctor to find his family. "Listen to me," Elias said quietly. "Do exactly as I say." Caleb's eyes remained fixed on the platform. "We have to run, not toward the street. They'll expect that. You don't know them." "No," the doctor replied. "But I know hunters." One of the strangers paused near the end of the platform and looked toward the freight shed. Caleb sucked in a breath. Elias moved quickly. He scooped Ruth into his arms despite the ache in his back, and pointed Caleb toward a stack of broken crates near the rear wall. There. Caleb shook his head. Dead end. Loose board behind the barrels. The boy stared at him. Elias managed a grim smile. I have treated half the railroad crews in this town. They hide whiskey, cards, and unpaid wages in more places than God intended. Another step sounded outside. The men were closer. Caleb grabbed the bread bundle and crawled behind the crates. Elias followed, Ruth burning with fever against his chest. He pushed aside 2 splintered boards, revealing a narrow gap leading beneath the freight platform. Caleb's eyes widened. Go, Elias whispered. The boy squeezed through first, then reached back for Ruth. Elias passed the little girl carefully through the gap, then forced his own old bones into the crawl space as footsteps entered the shed behind them. Dust, snow, and coal grit filled his mouth. He heard one of the strangers speak above. Boy was here. The second voice answered, rough and low. Girl, too. Caleb froze beneath the platform. Elias placed a hand on his shoulder, warning him not to move. Through cracks in the boards overhead, they saw boots crossing the shed floor. The first man kicked aside the blanket Ruth had been using. Still warm. Then they're close. The man with the rifle stepped onto the platform outside. Boss said bring the boy alive if the button's on him. Elias felt Caleb tremble. Alive if the button's on him? So they knew about it. The army button was not merely a keepsake, it was a marker, a key, a threat. The other man muttered, What about the girl? Silence followed. Too much silence. Caleb's hand tightened into a fist. Elias gripped him harder. If the boy lunged now, all 3 of them would be lost. No witnesses if she saw us, the rifleman said at last. Caleb made the smallest sound, half sob and half growl. Elias leaned close and whispered into his ear. Not yet. The boy shook with the effort of obedience. Above them, the men searched the shed, then moved toward the street side. Check the alley. Their boots faded. Elias waited. 1 breath. 2. 5. Only then did he motion Caleb forward. The crawl space beneath the platform led toward a drainage ditch behind the telegraph office. They crawled through freezing mud and snow melt until the doctor feared his knees would never forgive him. Caleb carried Ruth now, jaw clenched, while Elias followed with the medical bag and bread. When they emerged behind the telegraph office, the train whistle screamed again, covering their movements. A plume of smoke rolled across the yard as a freight train approached Cedar Hollow from the east. My clinic, Elias said. 2 streets over. Caleb shook his head immediately. They'll look there. Maybe. But your sister needs heat and medicine. She'll die if they find us. Elias looked at Ruth's flushed face. She may die if they don't. The honesty hurt, but Caleb understood. He nodded once. They slipped through alleys instead of main roads. Cedar Hollow had grown busier since the bakery incident. Word traveled fast when bread, theft, children, and old Dr. Monroe were involved. Elias saw curtains shifting as they passed. He saw the deputy near the livery talking to Mr. Harlan. He saw suspicion forming in ordinary faces. None of that mattered now. He led the children through the rear entrance of his clinic, a narrow, whitewashed building beside his small house. Inside, shelves of medicine bottles lined the walls. A stove glowed in the corner. A cot stood near the window beneath quilts worn soft by years of patience. Caleb placed Ruth on the cot with a gentleness that made him look much younger than 12. Elias immediately set to work. He removed Ruth's wet shoes, wrapped her feet in warm cloth, mixed willow bark and fever drops, and listened again to her lungs. The infection had settled deep, but not beyond hope. Not yet. Caleb stood beside the cot, refusing to sit, still clutching the army button through his torn coat. Will she live? Elias kept preparing medicine. She has a strong heart. That's not an answer. It's the best answer I can give. Caleb swallowed hard. Mama had a strong heart, too. The doctor paused. What happened to your mother? The boy's face closed. Men came at night. Elias waited. Good doctors knew silence could be a kind of doorway. Push too hard, and it shut forever. Caleb eventually spoke again. She hid us under the floor. Where? Old cabin near Mercy Creek. Elias knew the area. Abandoned farms, timber leases, a few mining trails. When was this? 3 weeks ago. The doctor felt cold settle over him. 3 weeks? Caleb nodded. They asked about Papa's button. Mama said she didn't know. They hit her. Ruth whimpered in her fevered sleep. Caleb's eyes filled with tears, but none fell. She told us not to come out no matter what. I heard a shot. Then fire. Elias closed his eyes briefly. He had spent a lifetime seeing what violence did to bodies. Hearing it from a child's mouth was worse. How did you escape? Root cellar tunnel? He touched the button again. Mama made me promise to keep this safe. Did she tell you why? Caleb shook his head. She said if a good man ever knew what it meant, I should run the other way unless Ruth was dying. Elias looked at him. And now Ruth is dying. She isn't dying. The boy said it fiercely, as if the words could become law. Elias let him have that. No, he said softly. Not if I can help it. A knock sounded at the front door. Caleb spun. Elias held up a hand for silence. The knock came again, firmer. Doc? It was Sheriff Jonah Pike, younger than Elias liked, and more ambitious than wisdom usually permitted. Caleb backed toward the medicine cabinet. Elias moved to the front room and opened the door only a few inches. Sheriff Pike stood on the porch, hat dusted with snow. Behind him, Mr. Harlan lingered near the street, pretending not to listen. Morning, Doc. Sheriff, heard you took in that bread thief. I treated a sick child. Pike glanced past him. Mind if I talk to the boy? Yes. The sheriff blinked. Beg pardon? I mind. Pike's expression cooled. He stole from Harlan, and Harlan has been paid. Still broke the law. Elias stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind him. So has hunger, if we're charging conditions now. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. He respected the doctor, but public authority had its own appetite. There are men looking for the boy. Elias kept his face calm. What men? Rail agents, I think. You think? They had papers. Papers saying what? Pike hesitated. Runaway miners. Possible theft. Might be connected to a dead woman near Mercy Creek. Elias's eyes hardened. And you believed them? I didn't say that. You carried their message to my door. The sheriff flushed. Doc, don't make this difficult. Elias leaned closer. A mother was murdered, Sheriff. 2 children are being hunted. If difficulty is what bothers you, choose another badge. Pike looked away first. That gave Elias a measure of hope. The young sheriff was not corrupt yet, merely uncertain. That could still be cured. Let me see the children, Pike said. Quieter now. Not until I know who gave you those papers. Pike glanced down the street. Man named Silas Vane. Railroad security. Elias recognized the name and disliked that he did. Vane had once been an army provost attached to frontier supply lines. Men who served under him tended to fear him more than enemies did. Where is he now? Boarding house. With the other man? Yes. Elias nodded slowly. Watch them. Pike frowned. Why? Because if they are who I think they are, they won't wait for warrants. Before Pike could answer, a crash erupted inside the clinic. Elias shoved the door open and rushed back. Ruth had knocked a cup from the bedside table in her fever, but Caleb stood at the rear window, pale with terror. They're behind the clinic, he whispered. Elias crossed to the window. In the alley beyond, Silas Vane and the rifleman stood near the back gate. Vane was older than Elias remembered, heavier through the shoulders, mustache streaked with gray, but the eyes were the same, flat, patient, cruel. He looked directly at the window as if he had known the doctor would appear there. Then he smiled. Elias pulled the curtain shut. Sheriff Pike entered behind him and saw the doctor's expression. Doc? Elias turned slowly. Get your pistol. Pike's face changed. Why? A voice called from the alley, smooth and cold. Dr. Monroe, we're here for the Turner children. Caleb grabbed Ruth's hand. Elias stepped between them and the rear door. 20 years of guilt, 1 dying soldier's promise, and 2 hunted children all arrived inside him at once. His hands no longer shook. "Sheriff," he said, eyes fixed on the door, "if you want to know whether you're wearing that badge or just carrying it, now would be the time to decide." Silas Vane's voice carried through the rear door of Dr. Elias Monroe's clinic with the calm certainty of a man who had never needed to raise his tone to frighten anyone. "Dr. Monroe, we're here for the Turner children." The words settled over the room like frost. Caleb stood beside Ruth's cot with both fists clenched, his thin shoulders squared in a way that made him look older than 12 and younger than ever at the same time. Ruth whimpered in fevered sleep, one small hand searching blindly until Caleb took it. Sheriff Jonah Pike stood near the front room, his face caught between duty and dread. He had come expecting a bread thief. He had found armed men at the doctor's back gate and a 70-year-old physician speaking as though the whole moral weight of Cedar Hollow had just been placed on the young sheriff's badge. Elias Monroe stepped toward the rear door, but not close enough to be seen through the window. "On whose authority?" he called. Outside, Vane gave a low laugh. "Territorial recovery order. Signed by whom?" "Judge Ellery of Fairwater." Elias glanced at Pike. The sheriff's eyes sharpened. Ellery had died the previous spring. "Interesting," Elias said. "Judge Ellery must have improved considerably since his funeral." Silence followed from the alley. Caleb's breathing hitched. Pike's hand moved toward his pistol. The doctor's mouth tightened. "Last chance, Sheriff," Elias whispered. "Choose." Pike swallowed, then drew his revolver. The motion was not smooth. He was young, nervous, and no gunfighter. But he drew it. Elias nodded once. Outside, Silas Vane spoke again, colder now. "Doctor, you are harboring stolen dependents connected to Army property. Children are not property. These are." The answer made Caleb flinch. Elias felt anger rise so sharply, his old hands steadied. "No," Vane sighed. "I was hoping age had taught you practicality. It taught me regret. Then don't add to it." Elias turned to Caleb. "There is a cellar door beneath the rug by the medicine shelves. It leads under the house." Caleb shook his head fiercely. "I'm not leaving you. You are taking Ruth." "No." Elias crossed the room in 2 hard steps and gripped the boy's shoulders. "Listen to me. Your sister has fever in her lungs. She cannot run through snow. But if those men take you, she will lose the only person left who loves her enough to fight." Caleb's eyes filled. "I can't carry her far." "You won't have to." Pike spoke before the doctor could. "My horse is tied out front. Take the side passage to the stable." Caleb stared at him with open distrust. Pike looked ashamed, but did not look away. "I should have asked more questions sooner. I'm asking them now." Another sound came from the alley. Metal against wood. Someone testing the latch. Elias handed Caleb a small bottle. "For Ruth's fever. 3 drops, if she wakes coughing." Then he reached into a drawer and removed a worn army revolver wrapped in cloth. Pike stared. "Doc?" Elias ignored him and placed the weapon in Caleb's hand. "Only if there is no other way. And never point it unless you mean to survive." Caleb looked terrified of the gun, which reassured the doctor more than eagerness would have. The rear door shook under a sudden blow. Ruth woke with a weak cry. Caleb scooped her up, struggling under her weight. Pike shoved aside the rug and lifted the cellar hatch. "Go." Caleb hesitated one last time. Elias softened. "Your father once saved my life by doing something hard before he was ready." The boy's eyes widened. "You knew Papa?" The door shook again. A crack appeared near the latch. Elias answered quickly. "Yes. And I should have found you sooner." That confession struck the room harder than the next blow against the door. Caleb stared at him as if trying to decide whether hatred or hope should come first. Then Ruth coughed, and the choice disappeared. He climbed down into the cellar with his sister in his arms. Pike lowered the hatch behind them and dragged the rug back into place. A final kick splintered the rear door inward. Silas Vane entered with his rifleman behind him. Vane removed his hat calmly, as though visiting for tea. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with iron-gray hair, a military mustache, and eyes that looked at people the way butchers looked at livestock. "Dr. Monroe." Elias stood between him and the cot. Mr. Vane. Vane's gaze moved around the clinic, the empty cot, the medicine bottles, the drawn pistol in Pike's hand. He smiled faintly. "Sheriff, I assume you have a reason for interfering with official business." Pike aimed his revolver despite the tremor in his wrist. "I assume you'll present valid papers." Vane reached into his coat slowly and produced the folded order. Pike stepped forward to take it. Elias watched Vane's other hand. The rifleman watched Pike. The air became thin. Pike opened the paper. His eyes moved across it. "This judge is dead." Vane did not blink. Territorial seals outlive men. Forgery doesn't. The rifleman raised his weapon half an inch. Elias spoke softly. "Don't." Vane smiled again. "Doctor, do you know what was lost at Antelope Ridge?" The name hit Elias like cold water. Pike glanced at him but kept his gun trained. "I know men died," Elias said. Vane's smile vanished. "Men always die. Records matter, not more than men. Spoken like a surgeon, not a soldier. I was both long enough to know the difference." Vane stepped closer. "Then you know Thomas Turner stole military evidence." Elias felt the years collapse. Field hospital tents. Rain. Mud. Screams. Thomas Turner clutching his sleeve. "The truth is with the children. He protected evidence," Elias said, "from criminals wearing uniforms." Vane's eyes hardened. "Careful." Elias leaned slightly on his cane. "Or what? You'll shoot an old doctor in his clinic?" "If I must." Pike's voice sharpened. "You won't." For 1 second the room balanced on bloodshed. Then a shout came from the front street. "Fire by the livery!" All 3 men froze. Another shout followed. Bells began ringing. Vane's rifleman turned instinctively toward the sound. Elias did not know what had happened, but he knew Providence when it opened a door. He swung his cane hard into the rifleman's knee. The man cried out and fired into the ceiling. Pike lunged at Vane. Elias shoved a tray of instruments off the counter, sending glass and steel crashing across the floor. Chaos filled the clinic. Vane struck Pike across the face and reached for his pistol. Elias grabbed a bottle of carbolic acid and smashed it against the floor near Vane's boots. The sharp fumes filled the room instantly. Vane cursed. Staggering backward, Pike tackled the rifleman into the medicine shelves. Bottles exploded. Elias grabbed his medical bag and rushed toward the front room, coughing. Beneath the house, Caleb heard the gunshot and nearly climbed back, but Ruth moaned his name. He forced himself onward through the low cellar tunnel. The passage emerged in the doctor's stable behind a stack of hay bales. Pike's bay horse stood saddled near the door, restless from the town bells. Caleb could barely breathe from fear and cold. He shifted Ruth over his shoulder and staggered toward the horse. "I can't," he whispered. Ruth's eyes opened. "Caleb? I'm here. Don't let them take the button." He froze. "What?" Her fevered eyes fluttered. Mama said, "Button opens the dead man's box." Caleb stared at her. "What box?" Ruth coughed weakly. "Train box." Outside, more shouting erupted. Caleb had no time to ask more. He shoved bread, medicine, and the revolver into one saddlebag, then struggled to lift Ruth onto the horse. She was small, but fever made her limp and heavy. He finally managed to get her across the saddle, then climbed behind her, gripping the reins the way his mother had taught him years before. The stable door burst open just as he kicked the horse forward. A man reached for the bridle. Caleb pulled the revolver but did not fire. The horse panicked, reared, and knocked the man backward. Then they were out into the snow. Cedar Hollow had erupted into confusion. A hay pile near the livery smoked but did not truly burn. People shouted anyway. Horses pulled against rails. Men ran with buckets. Caleb realized the fire was likely a distraction, though he had no idea who had made it. Then he saw a figure across the street. Mrs. Harlan, the baker's wife, standing beside the alley with one hand pressed to her mouth, watching him ride away. Beside her lay a dropped lantern near the smoking hay. Their eyes met for a heartbeat. She gave the smallest nod. Caleb understood. Not everyone had looked away. He rode hard toward the north road. Ruth slumped against him. Behind him, Silas Vane stumbled from the clinic with blood on his cheek, shouting orders. Pike emerged next, bruised but armed. Elias came last, coughing, medical bag in hand. He saw Caleb disappearing through the snow on Pike's horse and felt both relief and terror. "Where does that road lead?" Pike asked, wiping blood from his mouth. Elias stared after the children. "Mercy Creek." Pike frowned. Why would he go back there? Elias remembered Ruth's fevered words spoken before the escape. Train box, the old army button. Thomas Turner's dying plea, Vane's obsession. The answer formed slowly and terribly, because their mother hid something before she died. Vane, hearing him from the alley, turned his head. Their eyes met through smoke and falling snow. The hunter knew it too. Elias tightened his grip on the medical bag. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "saddle another horse." Pike looked at him. "For you?" The old doctor straightened despite his age. "For us." The young sheriff stared at the road where Caleb and Ruth had vanished, then at the forged paper in his hand, then at the broken clinic behind him. Something settled in his face. Not certainty, not courage yet, but the beginning of both. "Yes, sir." Across town, Silas Vane mounted his own horse with 3 men behind him. He no longer cared about appearances, warrants, or quiet retrieval. The Turner children were heading toward whatever their mother had died protecting, and Vane intended to reach it first. North of Cedar Hollow, Caleb rode into the white road with Ruth burning against his chest and the tarnished army button cold beneath his fingers. He did not know who to trust. He did not know what waited at Mercy Creek. He only knew the men behind him had killed his mother. The old doctor had known his father, and somewhere ahead, hidden inside something Ruth had called the dead man's box, was the truth his family had carried for 20 years. Caleb Turner did not look back until Cedar Hollow had disappeared behind a veil of falling snow. Sheriff Pike's bay horse pounded along the north road, breath bursting white in the cold, hooves striking frozen earth with a rhythm that seemed too loud for the empty country. Ruth lay slumped against Caleb's chest, wrapped in the doctor's blanket, her feverish face pressed beneath his chin. One of his arms held the reins, the other held his sister. Beneath his torn coat, the tarnished army button felt cold against his skin, as if the little piece of brass had become a living thing with a pulse of its own. Mercy Creek lay ahead somewhere beyond the timber ridge, but the road seemed longer than memory. 3 weeks earlier, he and Ruth had fled that same direction in terror, chased by smoke, screams, and the smell of burning pine. Now he was riding back toward the place where their mother had died. Ruth stirred weakly. "Caleb, I'm here. Are we going home?" He almost said no. Home had burned. Home was a black shell near the creek. Home was where Mama had hidden them under the floor and told them not to make a sound. But Ruth's voice was so small that he could not give her another cruel truth. "Almost," he whispered. She relaxed against him, believing him because little sisters had to believe big brothers or the world would become too frightening to bear. Behind them, somewhere in the storm, men were coming. Caleb knew it with the certainty children develop when hunted too long. Silas Vane would follow. The rifleman would follow. Maybe the sheriff, maybe the old doctor, maybe no one good at all. He tried to remember exactly what Ruth had said in the stable. Button opens the dead man's box. Train box. The words circled in his mind until they began connecting with memories he had not understood before. His mother sewing the button into his coat, lining by lantern light. His mother whispering that if anyone asked about it, he must say it belonged to his father. His mother hiding a small envelope beneath the loose brick near the stove. His mother burning papers after strangers rode past the cabin. His mother waking him in the middle of the night and making him repeat directions to an old rail spur near Mercy Creek. He had thought she was frightened. Now he understood she had been preparing them. The bay horse slowed as the road climbed. Caleb kicked gently, afraid to push too hard, but more afraid to stop. Snow thickened between the pines. The trees closed in, tall and dark, their branches heavy with white. The wind no longer blew in open gusts. It whispered through needles and dead leaves, sounding almost like voices. Ruth coughed. The sound tore through her chest. Caleb pulled the horse beneath a cedar and took the medicine bottle from the saddlebag with shaking fingers. 3 drops, if she wakes coughing. Dr. Monroe's words steadied him. Caleb counted carefully, though his hands trembled so badly, 1 drop ran down his thumb. Ruth swallowed and made a face. Bitter. Means it works. Mama said that. Caleb froze. Then he smiled despite everything. Mama was usually right. Ruth closed her eyes again. He fed her a tiny piece of bread softened with milk, then tucked the bottle away. As he adjusted the blanket, his fingers brushed the army button. He pulled it out just enough to see it. Crossed sabers. Broken star. Dent along the edge. It looked ordinary to anyone else, but men had killed for it. Men had chased children through snow for it. And Dr. Monroe had looked at it as if it were a ghost. "What are you?" Caleb whispered. The button gave no answer. Far behind him, a gunshot cracked faintly across the hills. Caleb jerked upright. Not close. Not yet. But close enough. He mounted again and drove the horse forward. Meanwhile, back in Cedar Hollow, Dr. Elias Monroe and Sheriff Jonah Pike rode out of town with 2 fresh horses and no official permission from anyone. Elias had changed into a heavy traveling coat, but he still carried his black medical bag strapped across his saddle. Pike rode beside him, jaw bruised, hat pulled low, one hand never far from his pistol. The young sheriff had not spoken much since leaving the clinic. Elias allowed the silence for nearly a mile before breaking it. "You did well back there," Pike snorted. "I got hit in the face, lost my horse, and let 2 children ride alone into a storm. You also drew on Silas Vane. Didn't stop him. Most men never draw at all." Pike glanced over. "That's supposed to comfort me?" "No. Just telling you where you stand." The sheriff looked ahead. "Where do I stand?" Elias thought about that. "At the beginning of becoming either useful or dangerous." Pike frowned. "Those are my choices? For men with badges, usually?" They rode another stretch in silence. Behind them, Cedar Hollow had grown restless. In front of them, the north road bent toward Mercy Creek. Elias's mind kept returning to Antelope Ridge. He had spent 20 years trying not to remember the details. But memory, once awakened, became merciless. The hospital tent, the smell of iron and wet canvas. Thomas Turner gripping his sleeve. The brass button torn half free from his coat. "They weren't raiders," Thomas had whispered. "Our own men sold the supply lists. Vane knows. Colonel knows. Children must carry what papers can't." Elias had thought fever confused him. He had thought the dying often spoke in riddles because death loosened logic. Then Thomas had pressed something into his hand. Not the button. A folded scrap with a name. Mercy Creek. Elias had lost the scrap during evacuation. Or perhaps, if he were honest, he had misplaced it because he was exhausted and afraid and wanted one less promise to carry. Shame burned even now. Pike noticed his expression. "You know more than you've said." Elias stared ahead. "Yes." "About Vane?" "Yes." "About the boy's father?" The old doctor tightened his grip on the reins. "Especially him." Pike waited. Elias eventually spoke. Thomas Turner was a sergeant in the 9th Frontier Cavalry. During the Antelope Ridge campaign, supplies meant for wounded soldiers and displaced families vanished. Food, blankets, medicine, payroll, gold. Officially, bandits took it. Pike's eyes narrowed. Unofficially, officers sold it. Men died from infections because medicine crates were empty. Children starved, while army wagons rolled full to private buyers. Pike's face hardened. And Turner found out. He found proof. Elias looked toward the dark timber ahead. Then the men behind it turned on him. Vane? He was part of the provost unit assigned to contain the scandal. Pike understood. Contain means bury. Usually, the sheriff spat into the snow. So that army button may identify the unit. Or a hidden cache. Or both. Both? Elias nodded grimly. Ruth said something about a dead man's box. Train box. Pike stiffened. Old rail spur at Mercy Creek. Elias looked at him sharply. You know it? Everyone knows it. Abandoned military siding from the war years. Boxcars left there after the line shifted west. Dead man's box, Elias murmured. The phrase suddenly made terrible sense. A dead man's box could mean a coffin, or it could mean a boxcar filled with the dead truth of a war no one wanted remembered. They pushed their horses harder. By late afternoon, Caleb reached the ridge above Mercy Creek. The cabin appeared below through snow and trees, or what remained of it. Blackened beams, collapsed roof, charred porch posts jutting from the ground like broken bones. Ruth woke when the horse stopped. For several seconds she stared silently. Then tears slipped down her cheeks. "Mama." Caleb couldn't answer. His throat had closed. He dismounted carefully and lifted Ruth down. The snow around the cabin had mostly covered the burn scars, but not enough. He could still see dark patches where fire had eaten earth. He could still smell smoke, though perhaps that was only memory. "We can't stay," he said. "I know." Ruth pointed weakly toward the creek. "Not there." "Then where?" "The train box." Caleb helped her walk toward the old rail spur beyond the trees. The tracks were barely visible beneath snow and weeds. Rusted rails cut through the forest and ended near a clearing where two abandoned boxcars sat tilted on rotting wheels. One had collapsed completely. The other remained upright, its wooden sides gray with age, its door sealed by a heavy iron lock. Caleb stared at it. "Is that it?" Ruth nodded. "Mama brought me here once. Why didn't she bring me?" Ruth's voice was faint. "She said you would try to open it too soon." Caleb almost laughed despite the cold. That sounded like him. He approached the boxcar. The lock was strange, older than any lock he had seen, with a round brass plate at its center and a narrow slot shaped almost like a button. His heart began pounding. Slowly, he pulled the army button from inside his coat. The crossed sabers seemed to fit the shape. Ruth leaned against a tree, shivering. "Hurry!" Caleb pressed the button into the slot. Nothing happened. He turned it. The lock clicked once, then again. Then the iron mechanism groaned like something waking after 20 years. The boxcar door shifted open an inch. Caleb stared, hardly breathing. Inside was darkness, and the smell of old dust, oilcloth, and buried history. He pulled the door wider. Faint winter light spilled over stacked crates marked with faded army seals. Medical supply boxes, ledger trunks, payroll chests. And near the center, wrapped in canvas and tied with cavalry rope, sat a coffin-sized wooden case with Thomas Turner's name burned into the lid. Ruth whispered, "Dead man's box." Caleb stepped inside. On top of the case rested an envelope addressed in careful handwriting. "To my children, if courage reaches them before the liars do." Caleb's hands shook as he picked it up. Behind him, a horse snorted. "Not theirs." He turned sharply. Silas Vane stood at the edge of the clearing with 4 armed men behind him. Snow drifted between them. Vane's face showed no surprise, only satisfaction. "Thank you, boy," he said. "Your father made that lock very difficult to open without the bloodline button." Caleb backed toward Ruth, envelope clutched in his hand. Vane stepped closer. "Now hand me what belongs to the army." Caleb looked at the crates, the coffin case, the letter, his sick sister, and the men who had killed his mother. Fear rose in him so fast it nearly swallowed his voice. But then he remembered Mama's hands sewing the button, Dr. Monroe saying his father had saved his life, Ruth coughing in the cold. He lifted the envelope and tucked it beneath his coat. No. Vane's eyes went flat. Wrong answer. A rifle cocked. Caleb stood in the open boxcar door, a starving boy in torn boots facing armed men in the snow, with the dead man's truth behind him and his sister's life beside him. Then from somewhere up the ridge an old voice rang out. "Step away from those children, Vane." Dr. Elias Monroe rode into the clearing with Sheriff Pike beside him, his medical bag at his side, his face pale from age and fury, his eyes locked on the man he should have stopped 20 years ago. This time the doctor said, "You don't get to bury what Thomas Turner died protecting." The clearing at Mercy Creek held its breath beneath the falling snow. Caleb Turner stood in the open doorway of the abandoned army boxcar with his sister Ruth behind him, the sealed envelope pressed under his torn coat and the tarnished cavalry button still warm from the lock it had opened. Around him were crates marked with faded military seals, old payroll trunks, medical supply boxes, and the coffin-sized case burned with his father's name. In front of him stood Silas Vane and 4 armed men, their boots planted in the snow like dark stakes. And on the ridge above, Dr. Elias Monroe and Sheriff Jonah Pike had just ridden into view, 2 men against 5, 1 old and 1 untested, both carrying more conscience than ammunition. Vane turned slowly toward the doctor, his face tightening with irritation rather than surprise. You should have stayed in your clinic, Monroe. Elias guided his horse a few steps down the slope, medical bag bumping against the saddle. I should have done many things 20 years ago. Staying quiet was one of my worst. Sheriff Pike rode beside him with revolver drawn. His hand trembled slightly, but he did not lower it. Vane noticed and smiled. Sheriff Pike, you are making a career-ending error. Pike swallowed. Maybe, but it's the first decision today that feels like law. One of Vane's men laughed under his breath. Vane lifted a gloved hand, and the man fell silent. His eyes returned to Caleb. Boy, you don't understand what you're holding. Caleb clutched Ruth's shoulder. Then why are you scared of it? The question struck harder than Caleb expected. Vane's jaw flexed. Elias heard Thomas Turner and the boy's defiance and felt grief mix with pride. Ruth swayed beside the boxcar door, fever draining the last strength from her legs. Caleb caught her quickly. Elias saw it. Sheriff, he murmured, the girl won't last long in this cold. Pike glanced toward the armed men. Then we need this over quick. Nothing about 20 years of lies ends quick. Vane took one step forward. Hand over the envelope and the button. The children walk away. Elias laughed once, without humor. You burned their home. I did not order the woman killed, but you brought the men who did. Vane's eyes sharpened. Careful, doctor. Elias dismounted slowly, wincing as his knees met the snow. No, I was careful at Antelope Ridge. I was careful when Thomas Turner begged me to find his family. I was careful when officers with clean gloves told me the matter was settled. I was careful for 20 years, and 2 children nearly starved under a freight shed because of it. He stepped forward, cane in one hand, medical bag in the other. I am finished being careful. The clearing seemed to shrink around them. Caleb looked at the old doctor differently then. Not as a stranger, not as a man who had appeared in a bakery and spoken his father's name, but as someone carrying a wound nearly as old as Caleb's life. Vane's tone cooled. You think Turner was noble? He stole Army property, deserted his post, and hid evidence belonging to the United States military. Elias stopped at the foot of the ridge. Thomas Turner stole back what thieves inside the Army had already sold. Vane's men shifted uneasily. Pike heard the admission beneath the accusation. What exactly is in that boxcar? The doctor looked at the crates behind Caleb. Medicine that never reached wounded men. Blankets that never reached displaced families. Payroll gold that vanished from official ledgers. And records proving who profited. Vane's face hardened. Speculation. A weak voice came from the boxcar. Ruth had opened her eyes. Mama said bad men hate names. Everyone turned toward her. Caleb whispered, Ruth, stay back. But she leaned against the doorframe, pale and trembling. She said Papa wrote all the names down. Vane's expression changed, just a flicker. But Elias saw it. Pike saw it. Caleb saw it. The child's fevered memory had struck truth. Elias took another step. Thomas left a letter, didn't he, Caleb? Caleb's hand moved toward his coat. Vane instantly raised his pistol. Pike raised his revolver. Vane's men lifted rifles. Time thinned. Snow drifted between gun barrels. No one moves, Vane said. Caleb froze with his fingers on the envelope. Elias kept his voice low. Silas, if you shoot that boy, every crate in that car becomes evidence you murdered to conceal. Dead children tell no stories, but doctors do. Vane looked at him. Not if they die too. Pike took half a step forward. You planning to murder a sheriff as well? Vane smiled faintly. A young sheriff killed by desperate fugitives? Tragic, but plausible. Pike's face paled. The old doctor saw the young man's fear and did not judge it. Courage without fear was often stupidity wearing boots. Jonah, Elias said quietly, do not try to be fast. Try to be right. Vane's eyes darted between them. Enough. He pointed at Caleb. Envelope. Now. Caleb's mind raced. He could not outshoot them. He could not outrun them with Ruth. He could not trust Vane. Then he remembered the lock. The button. The dead man's box. His father had built a way in. Maybe he had built a way out. Caleb looked behind him into the boxcar. Crates. Rope. A side door on the far wall, half buried behind a stack of canvas rolls. He leaned close to Ruth. When I say drop, drop. She barely nodded. Caleb pulled the envelope from his coat slowly. Vane's attention fixed on it. Every man's attention fixed on it. Caleb lifted it high. You want it? Bring it down? Come get it. Then Caleb threw the envelope straight up into the air. For one precious second, every eye followed it. Caleb grabbed Ruth and dropped behind a crate. Pike fired first, not at Vane, but at the snow near his horse, spooking the animal sideways into two gunmen. Elias hurled his medical bag at the closest rifleman, striking him in the face. Vane fired. The bullet tore into the boxcar wall above Caleb's head. Chaos erupted. Ruth screamed. Caleb dragged her deeper into the car while bullets punched through old wood. Pike fired again, forcing one man behind a tree. Elias stumbled to the boxcar steps, seized the fallen envelope from the snow, and shoved it through the doorway toward Caleb. Move! Caleb pushed Ruth toward the side door. It stuck at first. He slammed his shoulder into it. Pain flashed down his arm. It opened just enough for cold air and snow to burst in. Outside, the rail spur dropped into a shallow ditch leading toward Mercy Creek. Go! He shouted. Ruth squeezed through. Caleb followed, but before he could jump down, a hand grabbed his coat from behind. Vane. The man had climbed into the boxcar during the confusion, pistol drawn, face twisted with rage. You little rat. Caleb struck him with the only weapon he had, the tarnished army button still clutched in his fist. The brass edge cut across Vane's cheek. It was not enough to stop him, but enough to surprise him. Caleb twisted free and fell backward through the side door into the snow. Vane raised his pistol after him. Then Elias appeared in the opposite doorway with a rifle taken from one of Vane's fallen men. The old doctor had likely not fired a rifle in years, but at that distance he did not need artistry. Drop it. Vane turned slowly. You won't shoot me. Elias's face was lined, pale, and exhausted. That is what I thought too. For a moment, neither moved. Then a gunshot cracked from outside. Vane jerked as the pistol flew from his hand, struck by Pike's bullet from the clearing. The young sheriff stood with both hands locked on his revolver, eyes wide with shock at his own shot. I aimed for the gun, he whispered to himself, as if surprised law could still be precise. Vane lunged toward the side door anyway. Caleb was on the ground below, trying to help Ruth up. Elias swung the rifle stock into Vane's shoulder. The man crashed against a crate. Pike climbed into the boxcar moments later and pressed his revolver to Vane's chest. Silas Vane, you're under arrest. Vane looked up, breathing hard, cheek bleeding where the army button had cut him. For what? Pike hesitated. Elias answered. Forgery, kidnapping, attempted murder, conspiracy, and if God is just, 20 years of dead men. Vane laughed through blood. You have no court big enough. Caleb climbed back into the doorway with Ruth leaning against him. We have Papa's names. The laughter died. Elias retrieved the envelope and handed it to Caleb, then opened it. Caleb stared at the paper. His father's handwriting weighted across the front, firm and careful despite the years. To my children, if courage reaches them before the liars do. His hands trembled as he broke the seal. Inside was a letter and a folded ledger sheet. Caleb read the first line aloud, voice shaking. My dear Caleb and Ruth, if you are reading this, then I failed to come home, but I did not fail to love you. Ruth began to cry silently. Caleb swallowed and continued. The letter told them that Thomas Turner had discovered a theft ring inside the army after Antelope Ridge. Officers and contractors had stolen supplies, sold medicine, forged casualty reports, and used dead soldiers' names to hide payroll gold. The evidence was split 3 ways. One part hidden in the boxcar, one part carried by Thomas himself, one part entrusted to their mother if danger came. The army button was the key because Thomas wanted only his children or someone protecting them to open the car. Caleb's voice broke halfway through, and Elias gently took the letter to finish. Thomas named Silas Vane, Colonel Matthew Armitage, and a railroad contractor named Gideon Cross as the men who had ordered witnesses silenced. At the final paragraph, Elias had to stop. Pike took the paper and read aloud. If Dr. Elias Monroe ever finds this, tell him, I never blamed him. A battlefield makes cowards of honest men and heroes of frightened ones. Tell him the promise is not broken if he keeps it when the children need him most. Elias closed his eyes. 20 years of guilt moved through him like a storm passing over dead ground. Caleb looked at him. Papa wrote that? Elias nodded, unable to speak. Ruth reached for his hand. The old doctor took it carefully. Her small fingers were fever-hot against his skin. He forgave you, she whispered. Elias bowed his head. Outside, Vane's remaining men had been disarmed or fled into the timber. Sheriff Pike bound Vane's hands and secured the captured gunmen against the boxcar wheels. The snow had begun to lighten. A pale glow broke behind the clouds. Mercy Creek murmured beneath ice nearby, carrying cold water over stones as if nothing in the world had changed. But everything had. Caleb stepped down from the boxcar holding his father's letter, the ledger sheet, and the army button. He looked at the dead man's box, the crates of stolen supplies, and the old doctor standing beside him. What happens now? Elias looked toward Cedar Hollow, then toward the tracks leading south. Now we get your sister warm. Pike nodded. Then we take this evidence to the circuit judge. And after that? Caleb asked. The doctor looked at him with tired gray eyes. After that, we find out how many powerful men are still afraid of a starving boy with a button. At the edge of the clearing, Silas Vane lifted his head and smiled faintly despite the blood on his face. More than you think. No one answered. But the warning settled over them. Vane was captured. The boxcar was found. The letter had been opened. Yet Thomas Turner's evidence did not end at Mercy Creek. It pointed toward men still hidden behind uniforms, contracts, railroads, and money. Caleb held Ruth closer and looked at the road ahead. For the first time since their mother died, he was not running from the truth. He was carrying it. They did not leave Mercy Creek quickly, because truth, like the sick and the wounded, could not simply be thrown into a saddle and rush through snow without care. Dr. Elias Monroe insisted on tending Ruth first. No matter how loudly Sheriff Jonah Pike warned that Vane's missing men might return with help. The little girl lay wrapped in blankets inside the open boxcar while Caleb sat beside her, one hand holding hers and the other gripping his father's letter. The fever still burned in her cheeks, but the worst rattling in her chest had eased after Elias mixed stronger medicine from his bag. He worked by the weak gray light filtering through the boxcar door, old fingers steady as he measured drops, warmed cloth near a lantern, and checked her pulse with the grave patience of a man who understood that history could wait, but a child's breath could not. "Will she ride?" Pike asked from outside, where he kept watch over the prisoners. Elias did not look up. "Not far. We have to get Vane to town. Then town will have to remain where it is until I say otherwise." Pike opened his mouth, then wisely shut it. Caleb watched the exchange with wary fascination. All his life adults had used urgency as an excuse to ignore children. Hurry, hide, run, be quiet, don't ask, don't cry. Dr. Monroe seemed to believe Ruth's small body mattered more than soldiers, sheriffs, evidence, or men with guns. Caleb did not know what to do with that. It made him suspicious. It also made him want to trust the old man, which frightened him more. Outside, Silas Vane sat tied against one of the rusted wheels, cheek cut, coat torn, dignity bruised worse than his body. 2 captured gunmen sat nearby under Pike's watch. The others had fled into the timber during the fight. Snow covered the abandoned rail spur in uneven drifts. The old army crates inside the boxcar looked like ghosts from another country. Medicine boxes never delivered, payroll chests never recorded. Ledgers that had slept in darkness for 20 years while the men who stole from the dying grew rich. Elias finally stepped out of the boxcar, wiping his hands on a cloth. Caleb followed. "She needs warmth, broth, and a proper bed," the doctor said. "My clinic is no longer safe," Pike said. "Vane's men know it." Elias looked toward the tree line. "Then we take her to the church." Vane laughed from the snow. "Still hiding behind church doors, doctor?" Elias turned slowly. "Still mistaking mercy for weakness, Mr. Vane?" The prisoner's smile thinned. Pike crouched before him. "Where are the rest of your men headed?" Vane leaned back against the wheel. "You think I'm going to help you?" "No," Pike said. "I think you're going to lie, and I'll learn from the direction of it." Vane's eyes narrowed. Caleb looked at Pike differently now, too. The sheriff still seemed young, still scared in places, but the fear had begun shaping itself into something useful. Elias opened one of the ledger trunks while they spoke. Inside lay oilcloth-wrapped books, sealed correspondence, and lists of names written in a neat military hand. He removed the top ledger and turned several pages. His face changed. Jonah. Pike stood. What? Elias held the ledger open. These are not only supply records. Pike stepped closer. What are they? Transfers? Of money? Of children? Caleb went cold. Pike took the book and read. His lips tightened with each line. Caleb moved closer despite himself. What does that mean? Elias hesitated, and that made the boy more afraid than a quick answer would have. During the war, many families were displaced. Some children lost parents, some were separated during evacuations. Caleb's jaw tightened. You said transfers. Pike looked sick. The army was supposed to record guardianship placements. Elias nodded grimly. But these entries show children moved under false names. Some sent to labor farms, some to contractors, some. He stopped. Caleb's voice sharpened. Some what? Elias closed the ledger. Some disappeared. The old boxcar seemed suddenly darker. Caleb felt Ruth's fevered hand in his memory. He thought of his mother hiding them beneath the floor. He thought of Vane saying the children were property. Papa found this? Yes, Elias said. And your mother died because men still feared what he found. Vane spoke from the wheel. Careful how you dress up treason. Turner was no saint. Caleb stepped toward him. Before Elias could stop him, my father protected children. Vane looked at him with flat amusement. Your father stole evidence he did not understand. Then why did you need him dead? The words silenced the clearing. Pike turned slightly, surprised by the boy's aim. Vane's smile vanished. Caleb trembled, but he did not step back. And why did you need Mama dead? And why did you chase Ruth through snow? And why are you scared of a dead man's letter if he was wrong? Vane looked away first, only for a heartbeat. But enough. Elias placed a hand gently on Caleb's shoulder. There are answers in those ledgers. We will bring them out. To who? Caleb demanded. The sheriff? The army? The same people who let him die? Pike lowered his eyes. The accusation struck him even if he had not been born into the original failure. Elias absorbed it fully because it belonged to him. To a public hearing, the doctor said. Not a closed office. Not a military desk. Public. Pike nodded slowly. Church gathering. Elias looked at him. Can you hold one? If Reverend Bell agrees. He will. Pike glanced toward Vane. And if powerful men try to stop it? Elias looked at the boxcar full of evidence. The captured prisoner, the sick child, and the boy wearing Thomas Turner's button. Then Cedar Hollow will finally see what kind of town it wants to be. They loaded what they could carry. Thomas Turner's letter, the key ledger, Vane's forged recovery papers, several sealed Army correspondence packets, and a small payroll chest marked with the 9th Frontier Cavalry seal. Elias wanted to bring more, but Ruth could not wait in the cold while men argued with history. Pike bound Vane and the 2 gunmen to their saddles, then lashed the evidence chest to a pack horse. Caleb insisted on carrying the army button himself. Elias did not argue. As they prepared to leave, Caleb returned to the coffin-sized wooden case bearing his father's name. He had not opened it yet. The thought frightened him. Is he in there? He asked quietly. Elias came to stand beside him. I don't know. Do I have to open it? The doctor looked at the boy's thin face. Not today. Caleb swallowed. What if he's not in it? Then we keep looking. What if he is? Elias's voice softened. Then we honor him properly. Caleb nodded, but tears rose in his eyes for the first time since the bakery. He turned away quickly, ashamed of them. Elias pretended not to notice. That too was a kind of medicine. The ride back to Cedar Hollow was slow and tense. Ruth rode in a wagon Pike found near the old rail spur, wrapped in blankets with Elias beside her. Caleb sat close, watching every breath. Vane rode ahead under guard, hands bound, posture proud despite capture. The two gunmen followed behind. Pike kept scanning the tree line. Several times he thought he saw movement between pines, but no attack came. That worried him more than gunfire would have. Men like Vane rarely worked alone, and the ledger had named others. Colonel Matthew Armitage, Gideon Cross, contractors, officers, bankers, shipping agents. A whole chain of respectability built over graves. As Cedar Hollow came into view near dusk, church bells began ringing. Not in warning this time, but because Pike had sent a rider ahead from a farm along the road, people gathered in the square as the wagon approached. Word had already spread. The bread thief was returning with the doctor, the sheriff, a captured rail agent, and something from Mercy Creek. Mr. Harlan stood outside his bakery with arms crossed and face uncertain. Mrs. Harlan stood beside him, eyes red, hands clasped. Caleb saw her and remembered the smoking hay by the livery, the nod she had given as he escaped. He did not know whether to thank her. He did not know how to thank anyone. The wagon stopped before the church. Reverend Abel Bell, a broad-shouldered man with a gentle face and a voice made for funerals, hurried down the steps. "Bring the girl inside." Elias nodded. "Warmest room you have. Vestry stove is lit." The townspeople watched as Ruth was carried into the church. Caleb followed, but paused when whispers rose around him. Bread thief, Turner boy, army button, murdered mother, evidence. He felt the old urge to run. Then Mrs. Harlan stepped forward carrying a cloth bundle. The crowd quieted. She approached Caleb carefully, as if he were a skittish animal. "For your sister," she said. He looked at the bundle. Bread. Cheese. A small jar of preserves. Mr. Harlan stood stiffly behind her, shame working across his face like a man trying to swallow stones. "Boy," the baker said gruffly. Caleb stiffened. Mr. Harlan removed his hat. "I was wrong." The simple word startled Caleb more than cruelty would have. The baker looked toward the church door where Ruth had been carried. No child should have to steal bread in a town with full ovens. He held out another loaf. "This one isn't paid for." Caleb stared. "Then I can't take it." Mrs. Harlan's face softened. "It's given." Caleb did not know what to do. Elias appeared behind him. "Given things may be accepted, Caleb." The boy slowly took the loaf. "Thank you," he whispered. It was the first time he had said those words without fear in a very long while. Inside the church, Ruth was placed in the vestry near the stove. Elias worked over her while Reverend Bell brought hot water and blankets. Pike secured Vane and the gunman in the storage room under armed watch. The evidence chest was placed on the altar table. By lantern light, the church filled with townspeople until every pew creaked beneath the weight of curiosity and unease. Elias stood before them near the altar, suddenly aware of his age. His knees ached, his hands hurt from cold. His heart carried 20 years of unfinished duty. Pike stood beside him, badge catching lamplight. Caleb sat near Ruth but kept the army button visible in his palm. Reverend Bell opened the gathering with a prayer so brief that even impatient men could not object. Then Pike stepped forward. His voice shook at first, but steadied. "This morning, I treated 2 hungry children as suspects, because papers told me to. Those papers were forged." A murmur moved through the church. Pike held up Vane's documents. "The man who brought them is in custody. The evidence found at Mercy Creek suggests crimes far older and larger than a stolen loaf of bread." Elias looked toward Caleb. The boy nodded once. Not permission exactly. More like courage shared across the room. Elias opened Thomas Turner's letter and began reading aloud. The church slowly changed as the words filled it. At first, people listened with curiosity, then disbelief, then horror. Names of stolen supplies, names of dead soldiers, names of displaced children moved under false records, names of men who profited. The past entered Cedar Hollow not as rumor, but as handwriting preserved by a father who had died trying to protect his family. When Elias reached the line written to him, his voice broke. "If Dr. Elias Monroe ever finds this, tell him I never blamed him." Silence fell so deeply that even the stove seemed quiet. Elias lowered the letter. "But I blamed myself," he said. "The admission surprised everyone, including him. And perhaps I should have. I failed Thomas Turner once. I failed his family by searching too little and forgetting too easily." He turned toward Caleb and Ruth. "I will not fail them again." Caleb stared at the old doctor, anger and grief tangled inside him. He wanted to hate Elias for failing. He wanted to forgive him because his father had. He was 12 years old and exhausted, and both choices felt too heavy. Then Ruth's weak voice came from the vestry doorway. "Caleb?" Everyone turned. She stood wrapped in a blanket, pale but awake. Elias moved toward her, but she looked only at her brother. "Did Papa write us?" Caleb crossed to her and knelt. "Yes." "Did he say why Mama had to hide?" Caleb swallowed. "Yes." Ruth held out her hand. "Can I hear?" He looked back at Elias. The doctor nodded and gave him the letter. Caleb sat beside Ruth on the front pew and began reading from the beginning, his voice small at first, then stronger. The townspeople listened to a dead father's words in a child's voice, and something in Cedar Hollow cracked open. Shame, compassion, anger, maybe all three. But just as Caleb reached the paragraph naming Colonel Matthew Armitage, the church doors opened. Cold air swept inside. Every head turned. A tall man in a decorated army coat stood in the doorway with 6 soldiers behind him. His hair was white at the temples, his mustache trimmed, his posture immaculate. Colonel Matthew Armitage removed his gloves slowly and looked toward the altar, then toward the evidence chest, then toward Caleb. "That will be enough," he said. Sheriff Pike stepped forward. "Colonel, this is a public hearing." Armitage's eyes did not move from the boy. "No, Sheriff. This is possession of stolen military property." Caleb closed his fist around the army button. Elias Monroe moved between the colonel and the children, old spine straight despite every ache in his body. Armitage smiled faintly. "Dr. Monroe. Still making sentimental mistakes, I see." Elias looked at the soldiers, the frightened town, the evidence chest, and the 2 children behind him. Then he answered in a voice everyone could hear. "No, Colonel. For the first time in 20 years, I believe I am correcting one." Colonel Matthew Armitage stood framed in the open church doors like a man carved from authority itself. Snow blew around his boots and silver-trimmed coat, but not a flake seemed to touch the polished brass buttons across his chest or the immaculate collar at his throat. 6 soldiers waited behind him in formation, rifles held at rest but ready enough to make every person in the church understand the difference between a request and a threat. The sanctuary, only moments earlier filled with the trembling power of Thomas Turner's letter, now tightened under fear. Caleb Turner rose from the front pew with the letter in one hand and the tarnished army button in the other. Ruth sat beside him wrapped in blankets, pale but awake, her eyes wide as she stared at the man who had just ordered her brother to stop reading their father's words. Dr. Elias Monroe stepped fully between the children and the colonel. His old body looked frail against Armitage's decorated uniform, but his eyes did not waver. "This is a public hearing," Elias said. Armitage removed his gloves finger by finger. "This is an unauthorized display of military property." Sheriff Jonah Pike moved beside the doctor, bruised jaw darkening, badge catching lamplight. "Those are children, Colonel, not property." Armitage looked at him as if noticing an insect had spoken. "Sheriff, I suggest you remember the reach of your badge." Pike's face flushed, but he held his ground. "It reaches far enough to keep guns out of my church." Reverend Abel Bell, standing near the altar, cleared his throat. "The Lord's church, Sheriff." Pike did not look away from Armitage. "Then the Lord can back me up." A nervous ripple moved through the pews. Even in fear, a few townspeople nearly smiled. Armitage did not. His gaze shifted to the evidence chest on the altar table, then to Silas Vane, who sat bound beneath the watch of 2 townsmen near the vestry door. Vane smiled faintly when he saw his old commander. "Colonel." Armitage's expression did not change. "Mr. Vane." Elias noticed the distance in the greeting. Men like Armitage did not rescue tools once they became inconvenient. Vane noticed it too, and his smile faded slightly. Armitage stepped into the church, boots striking the floorboards with measured authority. Dr. Monroe? The materials recovered at Mercy Creek belonged to the United States Army. They were stolen by Sergeant Thomas Turner after the Antelope Ridge campaign. I am here to retrieve them and take custody of the miners found in possession of military property. Caleb gripped the button so tightly its edge bit into his palm. You won't take Ruth. Armitage looked at him for the first time, truly looked, and something cold passed through his eyes. You are Caleb Turner. Yes. Your father caused much harm. Caleb's voice shook but did not break. My father wrote down names. Your father betrayed his uniform. Elias spoke sharply. His uniform was betrayed before he ever touched a ledger. Armitage turned. You were a good surgeon once, and you were a good liar always. Gasps spread through the church. No one in Cedar Hollow had ever heard old Dr. Monroe speak that way to anyone. Armitage's jaw tightened. Careful. Elias laughed softly. That word follows cowards everywhere. For a moment, the colonel's polished mask cracked, revealing the anger beneath. Then he restored it. Sheriff Pike, I have a federal military recovery order. He produced a folded document sealed with red wax. Pike took it cautiously, read it, and looked toward Elias. This appears valid. The room sank. Caleb's heart dropped. Armitage extended one hand toward the altar, then the chest. A chest. Pike did not move. Appears valid is not the same as obeyed. Armitage's eyes narrowed. Explain yourself. Pike held up the document. This order authorizes recovery of property stolen by Thomas Turner. He pointed toward the evidence chest. But if these ledgers prove the property was stolen before Turner took it, then the order may itself be built on a false claim. The colonel stared at him. Pike swallowed, clearly surprised by his own reasoning but unwilling to abandon it. And until a civilian court reviews that question, I'm not handing over children or evidence. A murmur of approval moved through the pews, quiet at first, then stronger. Armitage looked around the church and understood what was happening. The town was listening. Worse, the town was beginning to think. Civilian ignorance does not override military jurisdiction, he said. Reverend Bell stepped forward. Nor does military jurisdiction override murder. Armitage's eyes moved to the pastor. You are out of your depth. I often am, the Reverend replied. That's why I pray. A few people muttered amen. Elias used the moment to look toward Caleb. The boy was trembling, but still holding the letter. Ruth leaned against his side. Caleb, Elias said gently, finish reading. Armitage's head snapped toward him. He will not. Elias's voice hardened. He will. The colonel stepped forward. Pike raised his revolver. The soldiers behind Armitage lifted their rifles. Chaos rippled through the church. Women pulled children down behind pews. Men stood. Reverend Bell raised both hands. No blood in this house. Silence teetered on the edge of violence. Then a sound came from the back corner. Wood scraping. Mrs. Harlan, the baker's wife, stood from her pew. Her face was pale, but her voice carried. Let the boy read. Mr. Harlan stood beside her, hat crushed in his hands. I. A blacksmith rose next. Let him read. Then a widow. Then a ranch hand. Then 2 railroad workers. One by one, the townspeople stood until nearly every pew held someone upright and afraid, but unwilling to sit back down. Armitage looked at them as though they had forgotten their place in the world. In truth, perhaps they had finally remembered it. Caleb looked at the standing townspeople, stunned. Yesterday they had watched him dragged as a thief. Today they were standing between him and soldiers. He unfolded the letter again. His voice was barely audible at first. If this letter reaches my children, then the truth has survived longer than I did. The church quieted. Caleb read on. Thomas Turner described the final days at Antelope Ridge, when crates of medicine were diverted, blankets sold, and payroll gold hidden under names of dead soldiers. He wrote of Vane, who enforced silence. He wrote of contractors who turned hunger into profit. He wrote of Colonel Matthew Armitage, who signed transport orders for supplies he later claimed were lost to raiders. Armitage stood motionless, but his face darkened with each sentence. Caleb reached a folded page tucked behind the letter. His brow furrowed. There are numbers, Elias stepped beside him. May I? Caleb handed him the page. The doctor studied it, then looked up slowly. These are casualty lists. Armitage spoke immediately. Military records. Confidential. Elias ignored him. No. These are altered lists. Pike moved closer. Altered how? The doctor's voice roughened. Men listed dead before they died. Others listed alive after burial. Names used to move payroll and supply claims. He stopped at one line. His hand began to shake. Pike saw it. Doc? Elias whispered. Thomas Turner. Caleb went still. Ruth sat upright. Elias looked at Armitage. This list declares Thomas Turner dead at Antelope Ridge. He was, Armitage said. No, Elias replied. He lived long enough to write this letter years later. Armitage said nothing. The contradiction hung in the church like a noose. Pike seized it. So if your official record says Turner died 20 years ago, how did you issue orders accusing him of stealing property after that? The townspeople murmured louder. Armitage's polished certainty wavered. Vane, still bound near the vestry, looked down at the floor. Elias turned another page. Dear God. Pike leaned in. What? The missing children's ledger. Armitage suddenly moved. Not toward Caleb, toward the altar. He was fast for a man his age, but Reverend Bell stepped into his path. The colonel shoved him aside. Pike lunged. The soldiers surged forward. Men in the pews shouted. Caleb pulled Ruth backward as Armitage reached the evidence chest and grabbed the ledger. Elias caught his sleeve. No! Armitage struck the old doctor across the face, sending him crashing against a pew. Caleb screamed. Ruth cried out. In that instant, Silas Vane made his own decision. Bound though his hands were, he drove his shoulder into the townsman guarding him and scrambled toward the side door. Pike turned, torn between Armitage and Vane. Vane shouted, He'll burn it all. He always burns it. The words stunned everyone, including Armitage. The colonel froze with the ledger in his hand. Vane laughed wildly now, fear and resentment spilling out. You think he'll save you? He'll hang every one of us before he lets that book reach court. Armitage drew his pistol. Silas. Vane backed toward the side door. No more. I buried women for you. I chased children for you. I burned the Turner cabin for you. And you walked in here like I was dirt on your boot. The church erupted. Caleb went white. Ruth began sobbing. Elias, bleeding from the lip, pushed himself upright. You burned their home? Vane looked toward Caleb, and for the first time shame flickered across his face. Your mother wouldn't give up the button. Armitage raised the pistol toward Vane. Pike fired before the colonel could. The bullet struck Armitage's gun hand, and the pistol clattered across the floor. The soldiers lifted rifles, but half the townsmen rushed them from the sides, not with skill but with fury. The church became a storm of shouts, overturned pews, and struggling bodies. Elias crawled toward the fallen ledger. Caleb moved faster. He darted beneath two grappling men, seized the book, and clutched it to his chest. Armitage saw him. Boy, Caleb froze. The colonel reached for him with his uninjured hand. Then Mr. Harlan stepped between them. The baker who had raised a broom at Caleb now stood with both fists clenched. You leave him be, Armitage snarled. Move. Mr. Harlan did not. Missus! Harlan pulled Ruth behind her. Reverend Bell helped Pike restrain the colonel. Vane was tackled near the side door by two railroad workers. Within minutes it was over. The soldiers, outnumbered and uncertain, lowered their rifles rather than fire into a church full of civilians. Armitage knelt with one arm twisted behind his back, his perfect uniform smeared with dust and blood. Pike cuffed him with hands that no longer trembled. Colonel Matthew Armitage, the sheriff said, breathing hard, you are under arrest pending civilian and federal review. Armitage spat. You have no authority. Pike looked around at the townspeople, then at the evidence chest, then at the children. Maybe yesterday I didn't. He tightened the cuffs. Today I'll grow into it. Elias sat on the floor with his back against a pew, dazed but conscious. Caleb carried the ledger to him. Doc? Elias looked at the boy, then at the book. You saved it. Caleb's eyes filled with tears he fought hard to keep back. He said they burned Mama. The old doctor reached out and pulled the boy gently into his arms. Caleb resisted for half a second, then broke. He buried his face against Elias's coat and shook without sound. Ruth, wrapped in Mrs. Harlan's shawl, reached for him. Elias held them both as best he could, one arm around Caleb, one hand on Ruth's shoulder. The whole church watched, and no one spoke. Some truths were too heavy for words when first revealed. Outside, the snow began to stop. Light broke faintly through the stained glass windows, touching the army button in Caleb's open palm. It no longer looked like a curse. It looked like a key that had finally opened the right door. But on the altar, the missing children's ledger lay open to a page that carried one more terrible discovery. Beside several names written in faded ink was a symbol Caleb recognized from the underside of the dead man's box, a broken star within a circle. And next to that symbol, under a column marked Surviving Dependents, were two names not written by Thomas Turner but by a later hand, Caleb Turner, Ruth Turner. Elias saw the names and went still. Someone had not merely hunted the Turner children because they carried evidence. Someone had listed them years before they were born. The names Caleb Turner and Ruth Turner lay on the open ledger page like two fresh wounds written in old ink. For several seconds, no one inside the Cedar Hollow church seemed able to breathe. Caleb stared at the page in Dr. Elias Monroe's hands, unable to understand how his name and his sister's name could exist in a book that smelled of dust, war, and 20 years of buried crimes. Ruth leaned against Mrs. Harlan's shawl, fever-bright eyes fixed on her brother as though she expected him to explain it, but Caleb had no explanation. He was 12 years old. He had stolen bread because his sister was starving. He had opened a dead man's box with a tarnished army button. He had heard his father's voice rise from a letter, and now a ledger older than his memory claimed he and Ruth had been listed before they were born. Dr. Monroe's face had gone pale beneath the bruise Colonel Armitage's hand had left across his cheek. Sheriff Pike stood beside him, one hand gripping the captured colonel's shoulder, the other still wrapped around his revolver. "Doc," Pike said quietly, "what does it mean?" Elias did not answer at once. His eyes moved across the page again, slower this time, searching for the possibility that age had betrayed him. But the handwriting was clear. Surviving Dependents. Caleb Turner. Ruth Turner. Broken star classification. Custodial value retained. Bloodline unresolved. The doctor's stomach turned. These were not ordinary orphan records. They were inventory markings. Human beings reduced to claims, debts, inheritance, leverage. He had treated men who had lost limbs without feeling the kind of disgust rising in him now. Caleb stepped closer. "Why are we in there?" Elias closed the ledger slightly, but Caleb reached out and forced it open again. "Don't hide it." The old doctor looked at him and saw Thomas Turner again, that same stubborn refusal to be protected from truth once truth had already hurt him. "I don't know all of it yet," Elias said. "Then tell me what you do know." Colonel Armitage laughed from where Pike held him. His wounded hand was wrapped in a strip of cloth torn from Reverend Bell's altar linen, but arrogance had returned to his eyes. "The boy deserves his answer, Doctor." Pike shoved him harder against the pew. "You speak when asked." Armitage smiled thinly. "But I am the only one here who understands that ledger." Elias turned toward him. "Then explain before I let every parent in this church guess what you meant by custodial value." The church shifted. Mothers pulled children closer. Fathers stepped into aisles. The phrase had landed with the ugliness Elias intended. Armitage looked around and realized the room was no longer intimidated by polished buttons. It was angry. "The ledger predates me," he said. "Liar," Vane muttered from near the vestry door. Everyone turned. Silas Vane sat bound between two railroad workers, his earlier confidence gone sour. Blood had dried along his cheek where Caleb's army button had cut him. "Don't pretend you inherited the program, Colonel. You improved it." Armitage's eyes flashed. Silence. Vane laughed bitterly. "That's all you ever had." Silence. "Burn the cabin. Bury the witness. Move the children. Change the names. Then stand tall in uniform and call it order." The church erupted in murmurs. Caleb's face hardened. "Move the children?" Vane looked at him, and for the first time there was something almost like pity in his expression. After Antelope Ridge, children of certain soldiers were tracked. Why? Caleb demanded. Armitage said nothing. Vane did. Because some soldiers had claims. Elias's mind began to connect the broken pieces. Claims to what? Vane glanced toward the colonel. Armitage's jaw tightened. Say another word and you'll hang before sundown. I'm hanging anyway, Vane replied. You made sure of that when you walked through those doors and called me dirt. He turned back to Elias. Land grants, survivor pensions, mineral rights, payroll settlements. The Army owed families money after Antelope Ridge. A great deal of money, but dead men with scattered families are easy to rob, Reverend Bell whispered. Dear Lord, Vane continued, voice rougher now. Some children were marked because their fathers had claims too valuable to pay. Some because they knew things. Some because their names could unlock accounts. Caleb looked down at the Army button, like the boxcar. Elias nodded slowly. Thomas must have known they would use his children someday. Armitage snapped. Sergeant Turner stole government property and constructed an illegal cache. To keep evidence away from you, Pike said. The colonel turned his cold gaze on the sheriff. You are a small-town boy playing lawman in matters above your station. Pike's face flushed, but he did not step back. Maybe. But even small towns know children aren't ledger entries. Applause did not come. The moment was too grave for applause. But something stronger moved through the church. Agreement. Elias reopened the ledger and followed the column beside Caleb and Ruth's names. Bloodline unresolved, he repeated. What bloodline? Armitage's mouth closed. Vane looked away. The answer was worse than Elias expected then. He turned pages back, searching the symbol of the broken star. Names appeared across several entries. Some crossed out, some marked transferred, some marked deceased. Beside 3 of them appeared the same note, Turner line. Elias stopped breathing. Thomas Turner wasn't only a sergeant. Caleb looked up. What? Elias read another entry. Thomas Elias Turner, recognized dependent heir of Captain Josiah Turner, 9th Frontier Cavalry, disputed estate held pending verification. Caleb blinked. I don't know what that means. Reverend Bell stepped closer. It means your grandfather may have been an officer. Vane snorted. Not may have. Was. Armitage glared at him. Vane ignored him. Captain Josiah Turner died at Antelope Ridge before he could file final witness testimony. He had land warrants, survivor settlements, and claims against Army contractors. Elias turned the page, and Thomas inherited them. Would have, Vane said. If he hadn't been declared dead before he could claim anything. Caleb swayed slightly. Ruth whispered, Papa was declared dead before he died? Elias nodded, grief settling deeper. Yes. Pike looked at Armitage. So when Thomas survived, wrote evidence, married, had children, his children became a problem, Elias finished. The room understood. Not fully, not legally, but morally, which mattered more in that moment. Caleb and Ruth were not hunted only because their father had hidden ledgers. They were hunted because their existence proved a chain of fraud. If Thomas Turner lived after official records claimed he died, then every transfer built on his supposed death could be challenged. If Caleb and Ruth were his surviving children, then stolen land grants, pension settlements, military claims, and perhaps parts of Antelope Ridge itself could return to them. Elias stared at the names. Custodial value retained. The phrase now made terrible sense. The children had value if controlled. Danger if free. Caleb's face twisted with anger. They killed Mama? Because of money? No one answered. That was answer enough. Ruth began to cry softly. Caleb turned and wrapped both arms around her, the ledger forgotten for one moment because even rage could not overpower his instinct to comfort his sister. Mrs. Harlan wiped her eyes. Mr. Harlan stood behind them like a man wishing he could erase yesterday from his own soul. Pike pulled Armitage toward the altar. Colonel, you will be held in county custody until a federal marshal arrives. Armitage's laugh was sharp. A federal marshal? Do you imagine I came without sending word ahead? By tomorrow, military escort will arrive, and every scrap of that evidence will be reclaimed under armed authority. Elias's blood chilled. Who did you send for? Armitage smiled. Men who understand loyalty. Vane cursed under his breath. Pike heard it. Who? Vane looked toward the church doors. Major Hollis. And if Hollis comes, this church won't stop him. The townspeople looked at one another uneasily. A few sat down. Fear, briefly driven back, returned like a draft under a door. Elias saw it spreading, and knew Armitage saw it too. The colonel fed on rooms, losing courage. Then we cannot wait until tomorrow, the doctor said. Pike frowned. What do you mean? Elias lifted the ledger. We take testimony now. All of it. Before every citizen here. Then we make copies. Reverend Bell straightened. The church has ink, paper, and 3 school slates. Mrs. Harlan raised her hand. I can write. The blacksmith's wife stood. So can I. A schoolteacher near the rear pew stepped forward. I will copy every name. The fear did not vanish, but it became busy. And busy fear was better than helpless fear. Within minutes, Cedar Hollow changed from a frightened congregation into an emergency clerk's office. The evidence chest was opened fully on the altar. Ledgers were separated. Thomas Turner's letter was copied by 3 hands. Vane's confession, bitter and incomplete but damning, was written down under Pike's questioning. Armitage refused to speak, but every refusal was recorded. Elias dictated what he remembered from Antelope Ridge, voice shaking only when he reached Thomas Turner's final plea. Caleb sat beside Ruth, listening as adults finally did what adults should have done long ago. Write truth where lies had been written before. As night settled outside, lanterns filled the church with trembling gold. Snow stopped falling. The wind quieted. Men rotated guard at the doors. Women brought food from homes and shops. Mrs. Harlan placed soup before Caleb and Ruth. Caleb hesitated until Ruth took the first spoonful. Then he ate as if his body remembered hunger all at once. Elias watched them from the altar, and his heart ached with a tenderness he had not expected. He had lived alone for many years. Doctors often belonged to everyone and no one. But when Ruth smiled faintly over her soup and Caleb tried not to show how badly he wanted another piece of bread, something opened in the old man that felt both dangerous and necessary. Near midnight, Pike approached Elias with a fresh page in hand. Vane gave us something. What? The names of 3 storage sites connected to the missing children records. Elias took the page. Are they nearby? One is. Pike hesitated. Old County Poorhouse. Elias looked up sharply. That building has been closed for 10 years. Officially. The doctor understood at once. You think children may still be there? Pike's face darkened. I think Vane wouldn't have named it unless he thought we'd find something bad enough to distract us. Elias looked toward Caleb and Ruth. Then we go before dawn. Pike nodded. I'll take men. I'll go too. Doc, you can barely stand. Then I'll sit on a horse with determination. Pike nearly smiled, then stopped when Caleb approached. The boy had heard enough. I'm going. Elias immediately shook his head. No. Caleb's eyes hardened. If children are there because of my family's ledger, I'm going. You are exhausted. So are they. Elias had no answer that would not sound cowardly. Ruth spoke from the pew. Caleb! He turned. You stay with Doc, she said weakly. I need him. He needs you to make him come back. The boy stared at her, caught between duty to unknown children and the sister who had always been his first promise. Elias crouched painfully before him. There will be a time to fight. There will also be a time to guard what you love. Caleb looked down at the army button in his palm. Finally he nodded. Bring them back. Pike answered, We will. Before dawn, a small party left Cedar Hollow. Sheriff Pike, Dr. Monroe, the blacksmith, 2 railroad workers, and Reverend Bell, despite everyone telling him not to come. They rode toward the abandoned poorhouse under a moon hidden behind clouds. Inside the church, Caleb sat beside Ruth while copies of evidence dried on pews around them. For a while, the building felt almost safe. Then, just before sunrise, the church bell rope moved. Once, softly. Caleb looked up. No one else seemed to notice. It moved again. This time a faint clink sounded beneath the floorboards near the altar. Caleb stood slowly. The army button in his hand had grown cold. He walked toward the altar, listening. Beneath the church floor, something scraped. Ruth whispered from the pew, "Caleb?" He turned toward the vestry door, where Mr. Harlan stood guard, half asleep. Then the floorboard under the evidence chest lifted less than an inch. A man's eye appeared in the gap. Caleb's breath stopped. Armitage had not waited for Major Hollis. Someone was already inside the church. Caleb Turner stared at the single eye beneath the church floor and felt every sound in the sanctuary vanish except the thunder of his own heart. The man below did not blink. He watched through the narrow gap under the altar where the evidence chest rested, one pale eye lit by the faint lantern glow above. For one terrible second, Caleb could not move. Ruth sat wrapped in blankets on the front pew behind him, weak from fever but awake enough to see fear enter her brother's face. Mr. Harlan stood near the vestry door, half asleep with a shotgun resting in the crook of his arm, unaware that danger had not come through the church doors but from beneath the floorboards. The copies of Thomas Turner's letter lay drying across pews. The ledgers were stacked on the altar. Colonel Armitage was bound in the storage room under guard. Silas Vane sat locked beside him. Dr. Monroe and Sheriff Pike had ridden to the abandoned poorhouse before dawn. The church, which had felt safe an hour earlier, suddenly felt like a trap. The floorboard lifted another inch. A gloved hand slid through the gap, fingers reaching toward the leg of the altar table. Caleb's grip tightened around the army button. He knew he should shout. He knew he should wake the whole church. But the man's other hand appeared next, holding a knife thin enough to slide beneath the floor and cut whatever rope or latch held the secret passage closed. If Caleb screamed too soon, the man might kick the board wide and overturn the evidence chest before anyone reached him. If Caleb waited too long, the truth his father died protecting would disappear into the darkness under the church. Ruth whispered, "Caleb?" The eye snapped toward her voice. Caleb moved then, not toward the man, toward the altar. He grabbed the nearest oil lamp and swung it down hard against the lifted floorboard. Glass shattered. Flame hissed out across the wood but did not catch. The man below cursed and jerked his hand back just as Caleb shouted, "Under the altar!" The church exploded awake. Mr. Harlan stumbled forward with the shotgun. Mrs. Harlan screamed from a rear pew. "Ah!" Reverend Bell's assistant scrambled from the side room. The floorboard bucked upward as the intruder tried to break through. Caleb threw himself against the evidence chest, pushing with all his weight. Ruth tried to stand but collapsed back against the pew. "Caleb!" 3 more boards cracked. A man burst halfway through the opening, face covered with soot, dark railroad coat torn at the shoulder. Caleb recognized him from nowhere, but the symbol on his collar made the army button in his palm seem to burn, the broken star within a circle. The man lunged for the ledger stack. Caleb grabbed the first heavy book he could reach and struck him across the face with it. The man snarled and seized Caleb by the coat. "Mister!" Harlan fired the shotgun into the ceiling to avoid hitting the boy, showering dust and splinters over everyone. The blast startled the intruder long enough for Caleb to twist free. 2 railroad workers tackled the man from behind, dragging him fully out of the floor passage. He fought like a cornered wolf, elbowing one man in the throat and kicking another into the pews. Mrs. Harlan rushed to Ruth and pulled her farther from the altar. "Stay down, child." Caleb grabbed Thomas Turner's letter and shoved it inside his shirt. The intruder saw him and lunged again. "Gimme that boy!" Caleb backed toward the pulpit. "No." The man's face contorted. "You don't even know what it is." Caleb lifted the army button. "I know bad men keep wanting it." That answer seemed to enrage the intruder more than any insult could have. He reached into his coat. Mr. Harlan raised the shotgun, but was too far. Then a voice came from the storage room doorway. "Cross." Everyone froze. Silas Vane stood there with one wrist still cuffed, the other hand bleeding where he had slipped partly free. His face was pale as ash. The intruder turned sharply. Caleb saw recognition pass between them. Gideon Cross, the railroad contractor named in Thomas Turner's letter. The man smiled without warmth. "Silas. Still breathing?" Vane leaned against the doorframe, breathing hard. "No thanks to Armitage." Cross glanced toward the storage room. The colonel always liked clean endings. He sent you through the tunnel? Vane asked. Cross shrugged. He told me where the church kept its old crawl space. I decided timing for myself. Mr. Harlan barked, "Hands where I can see them." Cross ignored him. His eyes stayed on Caleb. "Boy, you have no idea how many graves that letter can open." Caleb lifted his chin. "Then maybe it's time." Cross laughed softly. Thomas Turner said something like that once. The room went still. Caleb's voice dropped. "You knew my father. I paid men like your father. You stole from men like my father." Cross smiled. "I built rail lines, towns, depots, supply routes. History remembers builders, not hungry soldiers complaining over missing blankets." Caleb trembled with anger. "My sister almost died from cold." Cross looked briefly at Ruth. "A great many children do." Mrs. Harlan gasped, as if slapped. Mr. Harlan stepped forward, shotgun steady now. "You rotten devil." Cross finally acknowledged him. "Careful, Baker. The boy's evidence may make you brave, but bravery does not stop bullets." Then the storage room door slammed open behind Vane. Colonel Armitage emerged, one hand bound but the other gripping a pistol he must have taken from a careless guard. Blood stained the bandage around his wounded hand. His uniform was torn, but his eyes blazed with fury. "Enough." Cross turned, irritated. "Colonel." Armitage aimed at Vane first. "You should have stayed silent." Vane laughed weakly. "You should have killed me yourself years ago." Armitage's finger tightened, but Caleb shouted, "Don't!" The colonel's pistol swung toward him. "You have caused enough trouble for one starving little thief," Ruth cried out. "Mister!" Harlan raised the shotgun. Cross stepped sideways, trying to reach the altar. Chaos teetered again. Then from outside the church, bells rang wildly. Not the church bell. A handbell from the street. Someone was shouting, "Riders coming!" Riders from the south. Everyone turned toward the windows. Through frost-clouded glass, dawn had begun to pale the sky. Dark shapes moved along the main road. Not Dr. Monroe. Not Sheriff Pike. Too many men. Armitage smiled. Major Hollis. Fear swept through the church. The promised military escort had arrived before anyone expected. Cross recovered first. "Then hand me the ledgers and let the army settle its own mess." Armitage laughed coldly. "You think I still need you?" Cross's smile faded. "You need the railroad. I needed it before a church full of witnesses heard your name." Cross understood too late. Armitage was not here to save partners. He was here to erase them. The colonel fired. Cross jerked backward, struck in the shoulder, crashing against the altar table. The evidence chest slid dangerously toward the floor. Caleb dove and caught the corner with both hands. Papers spilled like frightened birds. Vane lunged from the doorway and tackled Armitage at the knees. The pistol fired again, shattering a window. Mr. Harlan rushed forward with two other men. Caleb scrambled to gather the fallen papers. Ruth. Despite misses. Harlan's protests, crawled down from the pew and helped with shaking hands. "The letter?" she whispered. "I have it," Caleb said. "The ledger. There are too many." She grabbed a loose page and froze. "Caleb." He looked. The page carried a list of storage transfers marked with dates after Antelope Ridge. One location was circled in red ink, Cedar Hollow Poorhouse Annex, the place Dr. Monroe and Sheriff Pike had gone. Beside it was written, "Remaining dependents to be cleared before military arrival." Caleb's blood turned cold. Doc. At that same moment, miles away, Dr. Elias Monroe rode through the rusted gates of the abandoned poorhouse with Sheriff Pike, Reverend Bell, the blacksmith, and two railroad workers. The building stood against the gray dawn like a place ashamed of itself. Long, narrow, half-collapsed, windows boarded, roof sagging beneath snow. No smoke rose, no tracks marked the front yard. Pike dismounted with his revolver ready. Looks empty. Elias looked at the boarded windows. So did the freight shed. They entered through a side door. The smell hit first. Damp straw, old sickness, cold ashes, and something worse underneath. Elias lifted a lantern. Empty rooms stretched down both sides of a long hall. Rusted bed frames, broken bowls, scratches on walls. Reverend Bell whispered a prayer. Then they heard it. A cough. Small. Hidden. Elias moved faster than his age allowed. Where? Another cough. Answered from below. The blacksmith found the cellar door beneath a collapsed table. Pike hauled it open. Cold air rose from darkness, carrying whispers. Children. Elias descended the stairs with the lantern held high and stopped halfway down because his knees nearly failed him. In the cellar were children. Not dozens, but enough to break a man's soul. 5 boys, 3 girls, wrapped in rags and blankets, staring up with eyes too large for their faces. Some were younger than Ruth. One child held a wooden soldier missing its head. Another clutched a torn army cap. Pike swore softly. Reverend Bell began crying openly. Elias whispered, "Dear God, forgive us." A girl of about 10 stood shakily. "Are you here to move us again?" The question carved straight through him. Elias knelt at the bottom of the stairs. "No, child. We're here to take you out." But as the blacksmith and railroad workers hurried down to help, Pike noticed fresh lantern oil near the far wall. Too fresh. His eyes snapped upward. "Doc." Elias turned. A fuse burned low along the cellar stones, hissing toward stacked powder kegs marked with railroad blasting labels. The poorhouse was not merely a hiding place. It was a grave prepared in advance. "Out!" Pike shouted. "Get them out now!" Back in the church, Caleb was already running for the doors with the red-circled page in his hand. Mrs. Harlan shouted after him, "Caleb, no!" Ruth tried to follow, but her legs failed. Caleb turned back only once. "Stay with Ruth." Outside, Major Hollis's riders had reached the far end of town, but Caleb did not run toward them. He ran to the livery, where Pike's spare horse stood tied. Behind him, the church erupted again as Armitage was dragged down and Cross groaned beside the altar. Vane shouted something after Caleb, but the boy could not hear over the pounding in his ears. He had been told there was a time to fight and a time to guard what he loved. Now there was a time to warn. He climbed onto the horse awkwardly, nearly falling, then kicked hard toward the poorhouse road. Snow flew behind him. The army button bounced against his chest. The red-circled page crumpled in his fist. He did not know if he could reach Dr. Monroe in time. He only knew that his father had left evidence for the living, not the dead, and if men planned to bury more children beneath another lie, then Caleb Turner would ride straight into the cold morning and break whatever silence stood in his way. Caleb Turner rode toward the abandoned poorhouse with the red-circled ledger page crushed in one fist and the army button hammering cold against his chest. The spare horse beneath him was too large, too strong, and too frightened by the boy's desperate hands. But Caleb clung to the saddle horn and drove it forward through the pale morning snow. Cedar Hollow vanished behind him. The church bell rang wildly in the distance, fading as the poorhouse road climbed through frozen brush and low pine. His lungs burned, his legs ached. His heart beat so hard that every hoof strike seemed to echo inside his ribs. He had no plan beyond speed. He only knew that Dr. Monroe, Sheriff Pike, Reverend Bell, and the others had ridden into a trap where children waited beneath a building wired to explode, and if Caleb did not reach them in time, the ledger would become another book full of names no one saved. The road narrowed near a dry creek bed. Branches tore at his coat. The horse stumbled once, nearly throwing him, but Caleb leaned forward and whispered, "Please, please." He did not know whether he was speaking to the horse, to God, to his father, or to his mother. Maybe all of them. Ahead, the poorhouse roof appeared above the trees like a black, broken jaw. Caleb saw no smoke, no movement, no sign of danger. That frightened him most. He kicked harder. At the same moment, beneath the poorhouse floor, Dr. Elias Monroe stared at the burning fuse hissing toward the powder kegs and felt the world narrow to a few impossible facts. 8 children in the cellar. 1 narrow stairway. Powder enough to turn the abandoned building into splinters. Sheriff Pike already moving toward the fuse. Reverend Bell lifting a little boy into the arms of the blacksmith. The railroad workers coughing from the dust. The fuse burned fast, spitting sparks along the stone floor, and Elias's old body understood immediately that he could not outrun it. He could perhaps stop it. "Get them out," Pike shouted, lunging toward the fuse. "Jonah, no." Elias cried, But the sheriff was already there, stamping with his boot. Sparks scattered but did not die. The fuse had been soaked in oil. Pike grabbed it with his gloved hand, swore as fire bit through leather, and tried to tear it free. It snapped, but the burning end continued racing along a second cord hidden beneath straw. The trap had more than one line. "There are two!" Pike shouted. Elias dropped to his knees near the nearest powder keg, searching with trembling fingers. "Three!" he said, horror filling his voice. A third fuse ran behind the stacked crates toward the far wall. Whoever set this wanted no mistake. Above them, the rescued children stumbled up the stairs, crying, coughing, clinging to strangers. Reverend Bell carried the smallest girl in both arms, while the blacksmith hauled two boys by their collars and pushed them toward daylight. "Move!" the blacksmith roared. "Out! Out!" Elias crawled toward the third fuse. His knees screamed. His hands shook. Smoke from the first fuse stung his eyes. Pike crushed the second line beneath a fallen bedframe, then turned and saw the doctor's coat catch on a rusted nail. "Doc!" Elias yanked free, tearing the fabric, and reached the third fuse just as flame entered the shadow beneath the powder stack. He had no water, no time. He seized the burning cord with both hands and pressed it into the cold dirt floor. Fire burned through his palms. He clenched his teeth and held it down. Pike reached him a second later and smothered the sparks with his coat. The cellar fell into a silence broken only by children crying upstairs and Elias's ragged breathing. For half a second they believed it was over. Then the far wall cracked. Not from powder, from movement. A hidden door slammed open, and two men rushed in from a tunnel beneath the old poorhouse annex. One carried a lantern. The other carried a rifle. Pike spun too late. The rifleman struck him across the head, sending him against the wall. Elias tried to rise, but the lantern man kicked him hard in the ribs. Pain exploded through the old doctor's side. "Major Hollis sends regards," the man said. Elias looked up through blurred vision. "Hollis?" The man smiled. "You thought the soldiers were only coming from the road?" He grabbed Elias by the collar. "Colonel Armitage warned us you were sentimental." Pike groaned, reaching for his revolver. The rifleman kicked it away. Upstairs, Reverend Bell shouted, "Sheriff!" The lantern man dragged Elias toward the powder kegs. Too late for sermons. Outside, Caleb reached the poorhouse yard just as the last children were being pushed into the snow by the blacksmith and railroad workers. They were thin, frightened, wrapped in rags, blinking at daylight as if the sky itself had become strange. Caleb reined in so hard the horse skidded. "Where's Doc?" The blacksmith turned, shocked. "Boy, what are you doing here?" "Where's Doc?" A little girl pointed back toward the building. "Down there." Caleb slid from the saddle before it stopped moving. The blacksmith grabbed him. "No, you don't." Caleb thrust the red-circled page into his hand. "There are men inside! They came through a tunnel!" The blacksmith's face changed. From inside the poorhouse came a gunshot. Everyone froze. Caleb tore free and ran. "Caleb!" Reverend Bell shouted from the doorway, but the boy was already inside, moving through the long hall toward the cellar stairs. Dust shook from the ceiling. A second gunshot cracked below, followed by Pike's voice, hoarse with fury. Caleb reached the stairwell and dropped to his knees, peering down through smoke. He saw Dr. Monroe on the floor near the powder kegs, hands burned and bleeding. Sheriff Pike struggled against the rifleman. Another man stood over them with a lantern, reaching for a fresh fuse coiled at his belt. Caleb's blood went cold. The first trap had failed. They were setting another. "You should have left children out of it," Elias rasped from the floor. The lantern man laughed. "Children are the only reason old men obey." He crouched beside the powder. Caleb looked around wildly. No gun, no knife. Only the broken stair rail, a loose brick near the wall, and the army button in his fist. Then he saw the lantern flame. If the man reached the powder, everything ended. Caleb did the only thing he could. He threw the army button. It flew through smoke like a tiny brass star and struck the lantern glass. The lantern cracked, flame sputtering. The man jerked back in surprise. Pike used the opening to drive his shoulder into the rifleman's knees. Elias, with a strength born from pain and rage, kicked the powder keg sideways, knocking it away from the fresh fuse. Caleb leapt down the stairs, grabbed the fallen button, and scrambled toward the doctor. "Doc!" Elias stared at him in disbelief. "Caleb, get out!" "No!" The lantern man lunged for Caleb. The boy ducked under his arm, but the man caught the back of his coat and lifted him off the ground. "You little curse!" Caleb kicked wildly. Elias tried to rise and collapsed. Pike wrestled the rifleman against the wall. The lantern flame flared again, licking toward spilled oil. The cellar began filling with smoke. Above them, the blacksmith thundered down the stairs with 2 railroad workers behind him. The lantern man saw the odds change and hurled Caleb aside. The boy struck the dirt floor hard, breath knocked from him. The man bolted toward the hidden tunnel. The rifleman broke free and followed. But Pike seized his ankle and held until the blacksmith dropped onto him like a hammer. The lantern man vanished into the tunnel. Pike tried to follow, but Elias shouted, "The children first!" Smoke thickened. The spilled oil caught along a straw pile. Flames climbed the wall. The poorhouse was burning now, even without powder. Caleb crawled to Elias. "Your hands." The doctor looked down as if only then remembering the burns. His palms were blistered and raw. Caleb's eyes filled with horror. "Because of us." Elias gripped the boy's shoulder with the least damaged part of his hand. "Because of them." The blacksmith lifted Elias bodily despite the doctor's protest. Pike grabbed Caleb and shoved him toward the stairs. "Move!" They climbed through smoke and collapsing boards. Reverend Bell pulled Caleb out first. The blacksmith emerged carrying Elias. Pike came last with the captured rifleman dragged behind him. Seconds later, fire burst through the poorhouse windows. The rescued children huddled in the snow, sobbing as flames consumed the place that had held them. Caleb stood shaking, watching the roof catch. Elias sat on a crate while Reverend Bell wrapped his burned hands in clean cloth. Pike pressed a hand to the blood running down his temple. The blacksmith kept one boot planted on the captured rifleman's back. No one spoke until the roof caved in with a roar, sending sparks into the morning sky. Then one of the rescued children, a boy no older than 9, whispered, "Are we free?" The question broke something in everyone. Reverend Bell knelt before him. "Yes." The boy looked uncertain. "For how long?" The Reverend could not answer. Caleb stepped forward. His whole body hurt, but he still held the army button. "For good," he said. It was not a promise he knew how to keep, but it was the only answer a child deserved. Elias heard him and closed his eyes, grief and pride crossing his face. Pike stood slowly and looked toward the road. In the distance, riders appeared. Major Hollis's military escort coming from Cedar Hollow after discovering the chaos at the church. Too many riders, too organized. The poorhouse burned behind them. The children stood exposed in the snow. Elias could not hold a gun with burned hands. Pike had only a few rounds. The blacksmith and railroad men were brave but outnumbered. Caleb saw the riders too. "What do we do?" Pike wiped blood from his brow. "We stand." Elias forced himself to his feet despite the pain. "No." Pike turned. "Doc?" Elias looked at the rescued children, then at Caleb, then at the burning poorhouse. "We don't stand here in the woods where they can call us fugitives." His voice grew stronger. "We take every child, every witness, every prisoner, and every page back to Cedar Hollow. We make them face the town." Pike stared at the approaching riders. "They'll cut us off." Caleb looked toward the old rail spur road. "Not if we use the creek trail." Everyone turned. "How do you know that trail?" the blacksmith asked. Caleb swallowed. "Mama used it when she ran from Mercy Creek." Elias met his eyes. Another piece of Laura Turner's courage had returned through her son. "Then lead us." The group moved quickly. Children were loaded into the wagon, the weakest carried in arms. Elias refused to sit until Ruth's medicine bottle was placed safely beside him, and Caleb refused to mount until the last child was covered. Smoke from the poorhouse helped hide their turn toward the creek trail. Major Hollis's riders reached the burning building minutes after the wagons disappeared into the pines. From the ridge above, the lantern man who had escaped through the tunnel emerged, coughing and furious. and pointed after them. "They took the children south!" Hollis, a hard-faced officer with a scar along his jaw, looked toward the smoke-veiled trail. "Then we take them before they reach witnesses." Back in Cedar Hollow, the church remained in upheaval. Armitage had been restrained again, but Gideon Cross lay wounded near the altar, guarded by Mr. Dumo, Harlan. Ruth sat on the front pew, pale and terrified, clutching the folded copy of her father's letter. Mrs. Harlan held her close. The townspeople watched the road, waiting for news. Then far away, through the morning air, they heard bells. Not church bells, wagon bells. Many of them. Ruth stood weakly. Caleb. Mrs. Harlan helped her to the doorway. Down the south road came the first wagon, then another, then riders, then a line of children wrapped in blankets and held by townspeople who had gone out to meet them. At the front rode Caleb Turner, too small for the horse, coat torn, face blackened with smoke, the army button shining at his chest. Behind him, Dr. Monroe sat in the wagon with burned hands wrapped in white cloth, alive. Sheriff Pike rode beside him, bleeding but upright. The rescued children stared at Cedar Hollow as if afraid the town might vanish if they believed in it too soon. Ruth began to cry. Caleb saw her on the church steps and nearly fell dismounting. He ran to her, and she ran as best she could to him. They collided halfway up the steps, clinging to each other while the whole town watched. "You came back," Ruth sobbed. Caleb held her tighter. "I told you I would." Elias Monroe, exhausted and in pain, watched from the wagon. He had spent 20 years thinking promises were heavy because they remembered failure. Now he understood they could also become bridges. But the moment of relief did not last. From the north road, another sound rose. Hoofbeats. Major Hollis and his riders appeared beyond the town line, rifles visible, uniforms dark against the snow. Pike drew his horse beside the church steps. Caleb and Ruth turned. The rescued children huddled behind them. Hollis slowed his horse at the edge of the square and looked over the crowd, the evidence, the prisoners, the wounded doctor, and the Turner children. "By order of military authority," he called, "surrender all recovered property and persons connected to the Antelope Ridge records." A murmur of fear moved through Cedar Hollow. Caleb felt Ruth's hand tremble in his. Elias climbed down from the wagon despite the pain and stood beside them, bandaged hands hanging at his sides. "Major," he called back, voice rough but steady, "you are 20 years too late to call children property." Hollis's eyes narrowed. "And you are one old man standing in the way of the army." Then Mr. Harlan stepped beside Elias. Mrs. Harlan followed. Reverend Bell. The blacksmith. The railroad workers. The rescued children. The townspeople. One by one, Cedar Hollow moved forward until the church steps became a wall of human witness. Caleb lifted his father's army button in the cold morning light. "Then the army can hear us all." Major Hollis sat on his horse at the north edge of Cedar Hollow, with 30 armed riders behind him and the cold patience of a man accustomed to being obeyed before he finished speaking. His uniform was darker than Colonel Armitage's, less polished but more dangerous, the coat of a field officer who had spent years turning orders into graves. A scar cut from his left cheek to the corner of his jaw, giving his face a permanent look of displeasure. Before him, the town had formed an impossible wall across the church steps. Bakers, blacksmiths, railroad workers, widows, shopkeepers, children wrapped in blankets, Reverend Bell in his soot-stained collar, Sheriff Jonah Pike bleeding from the temple, Dr. Elias Monroe standing with both hands bandaged white, and Caleb Turner holding a tarnished army button that seemed far too small to defy so many rifles. Ruth stood beside her brother, still weak, one hand clutching the copied letter from their father. Behind them, inside the church, Colonel Armitage, Silas Vane, and Gideon Cross lay under guard with more evidence on the altar than Cedar Hollow had ever seen gathered in one place. Hollis surveyed the scene slowly. His eyes paused on the rescued children, then on Caleb, then on the button. "You are obstructing military recovery," he said. His voice carried across the square without effort. Sheriff Pike rode forward a few paces. "This town is preserving evidence related to kidnapping, murder, fraud, and unlawful imprisonment." Hollis barely looked at him. "Stand aside, Sheriff." "No." The word came out clean and strong. Pike seemed almost surprised by it. So did half the town. Hollis's gaze sharpened. "You are young." Pike wiped blood from his eyebrow with his sleeve. "I'm learning fast." A few people shifted behind him, not laughing because the moment was too grave, but something close to pride moved through them. Dr. Monroe stepped beside Pike, his burned hands trembling despite the bandages. "Major Hollis, if you came for stolen army property, it is inside the church under civilian guard, and it will remain there until the circuit judge arrives." Hollis looked at the doctor with recognition. "Monroe." Elias held his gaze. "Hollis. Still alive. Not for lack of trying from your friends." Hollis's expression did not change. "You should have left Antelope Ridge buried." The square went silent. It was not a denial. It was something worse. Admission dressed as warning. Caleb felt Ruth's hand tighten around his. The rescued children huddled closer together. Reverend Bell raised his chin. "Major, these people have heard enough truth to know when a man is afraid of it." Hollis turned toward him. "Pastor, I do not take instruction from churchmen." "No," Reverend Bell said quietly. "Perhaps that is where much of this trouble began." Hollis lifted one hand. His riders shifted, rifles lowering slightly from rest to readiness. A ripple of fear moved through the crowd, but nobody broke. Caleb could hear someone crying behind him. Maybe one of the rescued children. Maybe Mrs. Harlan. Maybe himself inside a place too deep for tears to reach. The army button lay in his palm, cold and dented. Cross sabers dull under winter light. His father had made it a key. His mother had made it a promise. Men had made it a target. Caleb did not know how a boy could stand against soldiers, but he knew what would happen if everyone stepped aside. He had seen the freight shed, the poorhouse cellar, Ruth's fever, his mother's cabin burning. He stepped forward before anyone could stop him. Dr. Monroe whispered, "Caleb." The boy kept walking until he stood ahead of the adults, small in the open snow. Hollis looked down at him from horseback. "You are Thomas Turner's son." Caleb lifted the button. "Yes." "Then give me what belongs to the army." Caleb's voice shook, but it carried. "My father belonged to us before he belonged to you." The words struck the square with surprising force. Hollis's eyes narrowed. Caleb continued, louder now because if he stopped, fear would swallow him. "You say the button belongs to the army. You say the ledgers belong to the army. You say the boxcar belongs to the army. Yesterday men said the bread didn't belong to me either." He turned slightly, looking at the townspeople who had once watched him as a thief. "Maybe it didn't. But my sister was hungry. And when people with full shelves call hungry children criminals, something is wrong with the town." Mr. Harlan lowered his head. "Mrs." Harlan began to cry openly. Caleb turned back to Hollis. "When officers with full wagons call starving soldiers liars, something is wrong with the army." A murmur moved through the rescued children. Pike stared at Caleb as though watching the law speak through someone who had never read a statute. Hollis's hand tightened on his reins. "Boy, you are repeating words placed in your mouth." Caleb shook his head. "No, I am repeating what I lived." He held up the button higher. "If you want this, you can take it from my hand, but you will have to do it in front of everyone who now knows what it opened." Hollis sat still for a long moment. Then he smiled without warmth. "Very well." He nudged his horse forward. Pike raised his revolver. Hollis's riders raised rifles. The entire square tensed. Then another sound came from the south road, the sharp whistle of a steam train. Everyone turned. Black smoke rose beyond the depot. The Fairwater morning train rolled into Cedar Hollow, brakes screaming, iron wheels grinding against frozen rails. Hollis looked irritated. Pike looked confused. Dr. Monroe looked toward the depot and felt sudden hope he had not dared expect. A tall man stepped down from the first passenger car before the train fully settled, wearing a black traveling coat and a federal marshal's badge pinned beneath it. Two deputies followed. Behind them came a gray-haired woman carrying a leather document case and a younger clerk with spectacles fogged from the cold. The marshal walked straight toward the square, as if 30 soldiers and a town full of witnesses were merely weather. "Who is in charge here?" he called. Pike raised a hand slowly. "Sheriff Jonah Pike." The marshal looked him over. "You look terrible." Pike blinked. "Yes, sir." "Good. Usually means someone did honest work." Hollis rode forward. "Marshal, this is a military matter." The marshal removed a folded paper from his coat. "Not anymore." Hollis's face hardened. "By whose authority?" The gray-haired woman stepped beside the marshal and opened her document case. Dr. Monroe inhaled sharply when he saw her. "Clara Whitcomb." She turned toward him, recognition softening her stern face. "Elias Monroe. I wondered if I would find you still causing trouble. Only the old kind." Clara faced the crowd. "I am Acting Territorial Examiner Clara Whitcomb, appointed to review post-war claims connected to Antelope Ridge, missing dependents, and military disbursement fraud." Hollis's jaw tightened. Those reviews were closed. "Improperly," she replied, "and recently reopened when copies of Thomas Turner's partial testimony reached Fairwater by church courier last night." Reverend Bell smiled faintly. "I sent 2 boys before dawn." Pike stared at him. "You did?" The pastor shrugged. "Faith without works, Sheriff." Hollis looked toward his riders, recalculating. The marshal stepped between the soldiers and the town. "Major Hollis, you will stand down until jurisdiction is determined. My orders are now under federal review." The marshal's hand rested near his pistol. "Do not test how formal I am willing to become before breakfast." For the first time, Hollis did not answer immediately. Clara Whitcomb walked toward Caleb. Her stern face softened when she reached him. "You are Caleb Turner?" He nodded, suddenly shy now that the rifles were not the only thing looking at him. She crouched slightly despite her fine coat. "Your father's first packet reached my office 10 years ago. It was incomplete. We thought the rest had been destroyed." Caleb looked at Dr. Monroe. "Papa sent evidence before?" Clara nodded. "Enough to make powerful men nervous. Not enough to save the children whose names were hidden." Ruth stepped beside Caleb. "Can you save them now?" Clara looked at the rescued children, then at the church, then at the soldiers. "That is why I came." Hollis spoke from behind her. "Those children are connected to military claims." Clara stood. "Those children are connected to families." Her voice sharpened. "And if your office treated them otherwise, Major, I will see every page read aloud before a federal bench." The town responded not with cheers, but with a long exhale, as if every person had been holding breath for 20 years. The marshal ordered Hollis's riders to dismount and surrender rifles temporarily. Some resisted with looks, but none defied federal authority with the entire town watching and a train full of passengers now gathering near the depot. Inside the church, Armitage heard Clara Whitcomb's name and went gray. Silas Vane laughed from where he sat bound. "Told you he'd burn us all." Gideon Cross groaned from his wound. "Shut up." The public hearing resumed before noon, larger now and impossible to bury. The church could not hold everyone, so tables were carried outside into the square. The altar ledgers were brought under guard. Clara Whitcomb questioned Vane first. He tried to bargain, then blame Armitage, then minimize his own part. But Clara's questions were merciless and exact. She had spent years studying missing gaps in official records. Now the gaps had names. When she read the poorhouse ledger aloud, mothers in the crowd wept. When Pike described the powder kegs, men cursed openly. When Dr. Monroe testified about Antelope Ridge, he did not protect himself. He told them how he failed Thomas Turner, how fear and exhaustion made him accept silence, how a promise neglected could still become a debt paid late. Caleb listened beside Ruth, not knowing whether forgiveness was a thing that happened all at once or slowly like snow melting. But when Elias finished, the old doctor looked at him, not asking for absolution, only bearing witness. Caleb gave the smallest nod. Elias bowed his head. Then Caleb was called. He walked to the front, clutching the button. Ruth tried to come with him, but he squeezed her hand and said, "I'll be right there." Clara's voice was gentle. "Tell us what happened at the bakery." Caleb did. He told them about Ruth's fever, the freight shed, the bread, Mr. Harlan raising the broom, Dr. Monroe seeing the button. He told them about the men at the platform, the clinic, the ride to Mercy Creek, the dead man's box, his father's letter, the church floor, the poorhouse, and the children. He did not speak like a hero. He spoke like a tired boy telling adults what they should have noticed sooner. That made it worse. By the time he finished, Mr. Harlan stepped forward from the crowd and removed his hat. "I want it written," the baker said, voice rough, "that I accused that boy before I fed him." Caleb turned, startled. "Mr. Harlan continued, "and I want it written that if any child in this town is hungry again, they come to my bakery before they ever touch a stolen loaf." Mrs. Harlan took his hand. Others stepped forward then. The blacksmith offered space in his loft for the rescued boys. A widow offered beds. The schoolteacher offered lessons. Reverend Bell offered the church hall until proper homes could be found. One by one, Cedar Hollow turned shame into duty. Hollis watched from the edge of the square, expression unreadable. Armitage was brought outside under guard. When Clara read his own signed transport orders against the ledger entries, his polished silence finally cracked. He claimed obedience. Then confusion. Then that Vane handled details. Vane cursed him, cross-accused both. Their alliance collapsed in public, exactly as lies often did when too many liars tried to stand on the same sinking floor. Near sunset, Clara Whitcomb ordered Armitage, Vane, Cross, and several named associates transferred to federal custody. Major Hollis himself was suspended pending review and ordered to remain available for questioning. The payroll chest, Army ledgers, Dead Man's Box, and Mercy Creek evidence were sealed not by the military, but jointly by the marshal, the territorial examiner, Sheriff Pike, Reverend Bell, and 2 citizen witnesses, one of whom Clara insisted must be Caleb Turner. Caleb stared at her. "Me? Your father built the lock. Your mother protected the key. You opened the truth." "Yes, you." With trembling fingers, Caleb pressed the army button into wax beside the official seals. The cross sabers left a clear mark. Not ownership, witness. When it was done, Ruth leaned against him and whispered, "Can we stop running now?" Caleb looked toward Dr. Monroe, who sat nearby with bandaged hands resting in his lap. Elias heard the question and answered softly, "Yes." But Clara Whitcomb's face remained solemn. She approached Elias after the crowd began dispersing. "There is one matter left." The doctor sighed. "There always is." She handed him a smaller sealed envelope. This was in Thomas Turner's first packet. It was addressed to the physician who witnessed his last battlefield statement. Elias stared at the envelope. His name was written across the front in Thomas Turner's hand. Caleb came closer. Ruth, too. Elias opened it carefully, wincing from his burns. Inside was a single page and a small legal form. He read silently, then stopped. His eyes filled. Caleb felt fear rise again. "What is it?" Elias could not answer at first. Clara did. Thomas Turner named Dr. Elias Monroe as emergency guardian if both parents were lost and the children were ever found in danger. The world seemed to quiet around them. Caleb stared at the old doctor. Ruth's mouth opened slightly. Elias looked stricken. "I did not know." Clara's voice softened. "I believe that is why he wrote it." Caleb did not speak. His father, whom he had barely known, had chosen this old man before Caleb was old enough to remember choosing anything. But the old man had not come, not until the bakery, not until Ruth was sick, not until hunger forced the button into daylight. Anger rose again, but so did memory. Elias buying bread, carrying Ruth, standing before Vane, burning his hands on the fuse, saying he would not fail them again. Ruth stepped forward first. "Does that mean Doc is family?" Clara smiled sadly. "It means your father trusted him to become family, if you wished it." Elias looked at Caleb, voice rough. "No paper can demand your heart, son. If you want another home, we will find it. If you want only medicine and distance, I will give you both. I lost the right to ask for anything." Caleb looked down at the army button seal cooling in wax. Then at Ruth. Then at the old doctor's bandaged hands. "Can you bake?" Elias blinked. Terribly. Ruth smiled faintly. Caleb nodded. "Then Mr. Harlan can teach you." The doctor laughed once, broken and soft. It was not full forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a door. And for children who had slept in freight sheds and root cellars, a door that opened inward was a miracle enough for one day. As night settled over Cedar Hollow, the captured men were loaded under federal guard. The rescued children slept inside the church hall under warm quilts. The evidence was sealed. The town square emptied slowly, leaving boot tracks, wagon lines, and the memory of a starving boy standing against the army. Caleb sat on the church steps beside Ruth and Dr. Monroe. The button rested between them. No longer hidden, no longer hunted. Above them, the first stars appeared over the frontier. For the first time in weeks, Caleb did not listen for hoofbeats. He listened to Ruth breathing, steady and warm, and let himself believe morning might come without running. 1 year later, the first snow of winter fell over Cedar Hollow again, but nothing looked the same. The freight shed near the railroad platform had been torn down and replaced with a small shelter for travelers and orphan children passing through the county. The abandoned poorhouse was gone entirely, its burned ruins cleared and replaced with a memorial garden planted by the townspeople and the children rescued from its cellar. Harlan's bakery opened before sunrise every morning, and above the door hung a wooden sign carved by the blacksmith himself. "No child in this town goes hungry." People smiled when they read it. "Mr." Harlan pretended to dislike the attention, though everyone knew better. Inside Dr. Elias Monroe's house, warmth and noise had replaced decades of silence. Caleb Turner sat at the kitchen table pretending to study arithmetic while secretly watching snow gather outside the window. Ruth sat beside him, healthy again, arguing with complete confidence that one of Reverend Bell's chickens had learned how to recognize her specifically. Dr. Monroe stood at the stove attempting to make breakfast. Attempting was the important word. "The eggs are burning," Caleb observed. Elias frowned at the pan. "They are becoming seasoned. They're black. That is a seasoning." Ruth giggled. "Mr. Harlan says you cook like a man fighting a personal war against food." Elias pointed a spatula at her. "Mr. Harlan is a baker. Bakers are biased." The front door opened before anyone could continue the argument. Sheriff Jonah Pike entered carrying a stack of papers and a layer of snow on his shoulders. He had changed over the past year. The uncertainty remained in him because good men rarely lose all doubt, but confidence now lived beside it. "Morning. You're late," Ruth announced. "I was arresting cattle thieves." "Excuses." Pike laughed and removed his hat. "You're feeling better, I see." "I have been better for months." "Good. Then I brought the right paperwork." Caleb looked up immediately. "What paperwork?" Pike placed the documents on the table. Elias went still. Ruth's eyes widened. Caleb looked from one face to another. "What?" Pike smiled. "The territorial court finalized the last Turner claims yesterday." Caleb blinked. "Claims?" Elias sat down slowly. "Your father's." Pike nodded. "And your grandfather's." He opened the folder. The fraud convictions against Armitage, Cross, and their associates were upheld. The stolen military settlements were restored. The Mercy Creek land grant was returned to the Turner family. The mineral rights attached to it were verified. And the federal court officially recognized Caleb and Ruth Turner as lawful heirs. Silence filled the kitchen. Ruth looked confused. Caleb looked suspicious. "What does that mean?" Pike exchanged a glance with Elias. "It means your family isn't poor anymore." Ruth frowned. "How not poor?" Pike scratched his neck. "Very not poor." Caleb stared. "You're joking. I wish I were." "Paperwork this long is never a joke," Ruth gasped. "Can we buy a horse?" "One horse?" Pike laughed. "You could probably buy several." Ruth looked at Caleb. "Several horses." Caleb ignored her and turned toward Elias. "We're rich?" The old doctor rubbed his forehead. "Apparently." Ruth jumped from her chair. "Several horses." She ran into the next room before anyone could stop her. Pike leaned closer. "That was the first thing she focused on?" "You don't know Ruth very well," Caleb replied. Elias opened the folder and stared quietly at the numbers. For a man who had spent his life measuring value in heartbeats saved, the figures meant very little. What mattered was that Thomas Turner had finally been believed. His name had been cleared. His children were safe. Outside, church bells began ringing. Caleb looked through the window and saw people gathering in the square. A familiar figure walked up the road carrying flowers. Clara Whitcomb had returned for the dedication ceremony. Every year now, the town held a remembrance for those lost at Antelope Ridge and those rescued from the poorhouse. Names once hidden were read aloud publicly. No one could bury them again. By noon, Cedar Hollow filled with townspeople. Children played in the snow. The rescued boys and girls who had once hidden beneath the poorhouse cellar now attended school together. Some had been adopted. Others lived with relatives found through the investigation. A few remained in town permanently. The church steps where soldiers once confronted civilians now held lanterns, wreaths, and framed copies of Thomas Turner's testimony. Clara Whitcomb stood near the memorial garden, speaking with Reverend Bell. Sheriff Pike organized chairs badly. Mr. Harlan handed out bread better than anyone else, and Dr. Monroe stood beside Caleb and Ruth at the center of it all. The ceremony began quietly. Names were read. Stories were told. Tears were shed. Then Clara stepped forward holding a small wooden box. "Before we conclude," she said, "there is one final matter." Caleb immediately became nervous. Clara always sounded most dangerous when she was being formal. She opened the box and removed the tarnished army button. Gasps spread through the crowd. Everyone recognized it. The crossed sabers, the broken star, the dent along the edge, the button that opened the dead man's box, the button that exposed the fraud, the button that led Dr. Monroe to 2 starving children. Clara turned toward Caleb. "This button has served as evidence for a year. The courts no longer require it." She smiled slightly. "Its legal journey is complete." She handed it to him. Caleb accepted it carefully. The brass felt warmer than he remembered. "Your father protected it. Your mother hid it. You carried it. Keep it." Caleb swallowed hard. "Thank you." Clara looked toward Elias. "And one more thing." The crowd smiled because everyone knew what was coming except perhaps the old doctor himself. Sheriff Pike stepped forward holding another folder. Reverend Bell grinned openly. "Mrs." Harlan began crying before anyone spoke. Elias immediately looked suspicious. "Why is everyone looking at me like that?" Pike cleared his throat. "Dr. Elias Monroe." "No, I haven't said anything yet. Whatever it is, no." Laughter spread through the square. Pike ignored him and opened the folder. By recommendation of the Turner heirs, the town council, the territorial examiner's office, and every surviving child rescued from the poorhouse, Elias groaned. "You are hereby recognized as legal guardian and adoptive parent of Caleb and Ruth Turner, pending their approval." The crowd applauded. Ruth shouted, "Yes," before anyone else could speak. Caleb's face turned red. Elias looked completely overwhelmed. "That is not how these things are supposed to happen." Clara smiled. "Yet here we are." Elias turned toward Caleb. For a moment neither spoke. A year earlier they had been strangers connected only by guilt, hunger, and a dead man's promise. Now they stood together beneath falling snow while an entire town waited. "You don't have to," Elias said quietly. Caleb looked down at the button, then at Ruth, then at the old doctor whose hands still carried faint scars from the fuse he had smothered in the poorhouse cellar. "I know." Elias nodded. "I still burn breakfast. I know. I am old." "Very," a few people laughed. Elias sighed. "And I should have found you sooner." Caleb was silent for several seconds. Then he stepped forward and hugged him. The crowd disappeared. The snow disappeared. The years disappeared. There was only a boy who had lost everything and an old man who had spent too long believing failure was permanent. Elias wrapped his arms around Caleb and held on. Ruth joined the hug immediately, because waiting was not one of her talents. Around them, Cedar Hollow applauded. Some cried, some laughed. Most did both. Above the memorial garden, snow drifted softly through winter sunlight. The army button rested safely in Caleb's pocket, not as evidence, not as a key, not as a burden, as family history, as proof that courage could survive longer than fear, as proof that one starving boy stealing bread could change an entire town. And somewhere beyond memory, beyond war, beyond Antelope Ridge, Perhaps Thomas and Laura Turner finally rested knowing their children no longer had to run. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to like the video and share it with someone who believes kindness still matters. Subscribe to the channel for more emotional frontier stories about courage, family, sacrifice, and second chances. And before you go, tell us in the comments, what was the most powerful moment in Caleb's journey? The stolen loaf of bread, the army button, the dead man's box, or the moment Cedar Hollow stood together against the soldiers? We read every comment, and your support helps bring more unforgettable stories to life. Until next time, thank you for listening, and may every lost child find a place to call home.